Before I get into my mixing spiel about today, which is 6 subjects. Subjects are dynamics, EQ, panning, effects, mix groups, submixes, and deliverables. Those are 6 things I want to get into. But first, I want to touch on some resources that are really cool. All right, I heard this yesterday. History is lived forwards and understood backwards. And it's a historian on YouTube named Tick. And I like that, so I wrote it down. But what I want to get into, and this is Adam Neely's channel. Highly recommended. Highly recommended. Incredible bass player. The reason I stumbled on him, I was going down a Bela Bartok rabbit hole. This is something, some more free resources, right? Sound Gym. Check this out. You can create an account, log in. It's free.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Who knows it? Nico. Yeah, this thing is great.
I test my ears on it every day, almost.
It's yeah, that's it. You like get into the studio and you just do this, and I wanted to demonstrate it for you, but I used the free version and I already played my games for today. Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But these like exercises for mixing or listening frequencies, things like that?
Yes. The free ones you get are a stereo test, and you have to click on where you think it is in the stereo field, and you keep, as long as you keep getting it right, and there's like a wide margin for error, so you click in the area you think it is, and then it shows you exactly where it is, and as long as you're in the zone, you can keep playing. But like you get 3 wrong and you're shut out for the day.
Right.
But it's free. And there's another one which I haven't done today. This will be cool for the musicians. It's the same place. It's called Tone Gym, but it's music training. Okay, it's give me the key and then 1, 4, 5. I love the engineering one. Like the options. You're listening for stereo field in the free version. You get the panning test, you get the gain test, and then there's the EQ test where you listen to it. They have the version flat, and then you click on the same version with the EQ boosting one frequency. And you have to guess what that frequency is. And that's probably the closest to a musical ear training is a frequency training. Because, when we get used to thinking, around 62 is, or 64, 65, that's C, we can almost do the math on stage when something is feeding back. It's like, that's a G, it's probably this or that, and you could probably do the math. Because there's that, a note is a frequency can be a note. It's where the two disciplines meet, is at the frequency. So for me, I like the EQ one. I'm pretty good at that because I have a good ear for music. But the stereo one gets me once in a while, and the gain one gets me more often. Moving on, dynamics. The reason there are machines to control dynamics, it started with the radio. And it probably, I believe, it started in a military environment where you needed to hear. I mean, that's the most critical listening environment there is. And now we're talking about the British that were ahead of everyone on this. Now, what the thing is, you need to be able to hear the quietest thing the person says, but you also need it not to be too loud. And in this sense, it's like a signal strength. You don't want the signal strength to be so loud that the radio signal can be picked up by the enemy. So you need to limit the amount of signal you send out. And by doing that, you can add gain and hear the quietest parts of the message, so you can hear it as clearly as possible. You can imagine like the military application for that. Now take that to the commercial application. You own a radio station and you have a license to transmit up to, 40,000 watts. Now, watts in this sense is kind of basically a measure of distance. You're really, you're not buying watts. I mean, you're buying, you're paying more for more watts because you reach more people. And the commercials that you run reach more people, and you can charge more to play commercials on your radio. So that's the game. The bigger that was the game. Now it's all monopolized and stuff. But back then, the radio signal, if you had like 10 kilometers of a radius, and you paid for that, and maybe it was 10,000 watts, and you were if you somehow exceeded your range, you would be fined. You would have to pay for that. You would be penalized every time your signal exceeded the range, because you're reaching more customers and you should be paying more to reach more customers, and that's the commercial. So limiters were really important to make sure that the gain never passed a certain level. It's basically putting a ceiling on the output so that you would not trespass your signal and then get fined by the government. And in doing that, people started learning about like the practical application of being able to hit, once you had a good limiter, you could also add more gain freely without without having to worry about any consequences, right? So people started adding more gain to their output before the limiter, so you could hear the quietest bits, and it sounded loud, even though it wasn't louder than any other 10K signal, but it sounded louder. You know what I mean? And that's when we started getting into the issue of loudness and trying to sound, that 1 dB of difference, like I was talking about the other day, it can be all the difference, and calling attention to the song. That became like the practical application of compression. But then it started becoming artistic. I mean, of course, compressors were needed in the studio. Compressors and limiters, they behave differently. A limiter would just be like a finite, like, the signal will not pass this gain. It's like a solid concrete ceiling that cannot be passed. A compressor interacts more with the signal, and as much or as little as you want or need it to. And it's different because there's it can be overrided if in circumstances. So there is no definite, it could pass the limit. Depend if you're using it lightly, then it's still a gray area whether or not, but a limiter is a brick wall, literally. Compressors in the recording studio were important to keep the signal from distorting on the tape machine. So they were used in recording until there was, they still are. I don't use them particularly, and especially when I record to tape, I don't use compression because I like the sound of recording with a lot of signal to tape, because the tape is a compressor. It's a limiter. A tape will only accept a certain amount of gain. And when it saturates, it doesn't like clip in the digital sense. It just kind of sounds cool, depending on, it's like a smooth, natural, physical distortion, which can be very pleasing. So I think, I normally, if you guys have a chance to record a tape, I would say, don't use, I would use a high pass on everything, including the bass and the kick drum, and I would just make sure as much gain as possible as you could get on the tape. We will talk about that now. All right. All right. There are 4 types of compressions, and they are classified by their detection circuit. There are millions of compressors. They all have different looks and behaviors and topography. They're all built differently. There probably is, there's many compressors out there, maybe as microphones. I don't know, but there's huge variety because they all do have their own behavior. They really do, but their job is the same, and the way they do it is different. So there are 4 types of compressors. I'm going to list them from fast to slow. The detectors. All right. The fastest, number 1, fastest compressor, the compressor that responds fastest to an excessive gain is the VCA. It uses a voltage control amplifier to detect the signal, and it's the fastest circuit they got. A good example of that would be the SSL mixed bus compressor. They're like very transparent. Unless you want them to sound aggressive, they can do that too. But if you just want it to sound, if you don't want to hear them, they're great at it. If you don't want to hear the work of the compressor, they're very fast. They do the job very fast. They're in and out on the transient. You never knew what happened. So people like them on the mix. People also like them, as drum compressors, you can imagine. The next fastest, still very fast, is the FET, Field Emission Transformer, I believe. It's a different type of circuit. It doesn't detect voltage. I think it might be magnetic. I don't know what it is, but it's almost as fast as the VCA. And it was invented to sort of emulate what tubes do, what valves do, but it has a certain brightness to it that people really like. So a famous FET compressor, the most famous would be the 1176, made by Uri originally, and now by Universal Audio. And there are tons and tons of emulations and versions. My favorite 1176 style compressor are the purples. They're really fantastic. I like them on the drums, So they're not exactly transparent. They're fun. They're fun compressors. They're fast. They sound cool. They add a certain amount of like 5 kilohertz or something to the overall sound. So in fact, it pairs really well with a ribbon microphone. So when I'm recording voice here, I will pass it through the purple, and it usually, maybe it'll do like it's hardly working on the voice unless somebody screams. But at the same time, it sort of adds a little brightness, and that pairs well with a ribbon mic, I think. Okay, the next slowest is the opto compressor, and it uses an optical cell to detect the gain change. And what happens is it's a photoelectric cell placed in front of an LED. And the LED, depending on the gain, burns brighter or not. So the more gain, the brighter the LED gets, and this photoelectric cell detects it, and that's what activates the compression. And that whole process is, relatively slow compared to, the VCA. Compared to voltage, it's not that light is slow. We know that it isn't. It's that an LED is slow. It takes a millisecond to get. So they have very slow, what we would call the attack, is slower. It's not the kind of thing. It's not the kind of compressor you would use to record maybe something with a lot of transients, like a percussion, like a xylophone or something, or a snare drum, or something with a very fast transient. This would not be the compressor for that. It excels on the voice. It excels on horns, depending on the bass. Depending on the way the bass is being played, sounds amazing on the bass guitar. It's just a great leveling. It's kind of transparent in the way it compresses. You don't necessarily hear the compression, but it also has this output stage that now I'm speaking specifically of the LA2A, which is another universal. It was a Teletronics, now it's Universal Audio. The LA2A is the example of an optical compressor. So it responds a little more. It's more sluggish on the response, but there's a lot in it that that makes it a favorite until today. And the slowest of all is called the Vari-Mu. Vari-Mu. I don't know the story behind that term, but I do know that the detection circuit are valves, are tubes, and they're even slower than the optical circuit. So from fastest to slowest, the four are VCA, FET, Opto, and Vari-Mu, or tube. If you might see tube compressor. Other compressors have tubes, but they don't use them in the detection circuit. Like the LA2A has 4 tubes, and that's why it sounds so good. But none of them are part of the detection circuit. Interestingly enough, the two most preferred compressors on a mix bus are the fastest and the slowest. The fastest, we all know that the fastest is is the VCA, and that's what SSL built into their mixing desk, and it became such the standard in mix compression that now it's really easy to find plugins and outboard emulations and the original SSL. They make it as an outboard piece of gear now. It became so popular that it really became famous. But a lot of people also like on the mix the Manley Vari-Mu compressor, Vari-Mu, which is very slow. It's extremely slow. But the thing is, the way, once it's engaged, once it has engaged and is doing and is controlling the signal of what's coming through, it doesn't release. It sort of just stays there. There's no more. The big game between all compressor behaviors is the attack and the release. The attack is like you can choose on most. Some compressors don't even have these controls, but the controls you would be looking for. This is kind of a typical compressor. Now the threshold is on. There are compressors with more controls and there are compressors with less controls, but you could expect these on a compressor, at least to understand what's happening. Threshold is where you decide at what gain does the compressor engage, right? Respond to it. And then ratio is how much it responds to the signal that passed the threshold. 2-to-1 is very light. 5-to-1 is much more of a response. And once it does respond, all right, we'll leave this for last. Down here, the attack is when you want it to engage. So it could be like 0 milliseconds up to 200 milliseconds when it does respond. So it passes the threshold here, the signal, and here it'll engage sooner or later. And here it will disengage sooner or later. So this is what happens when you've compressed the signal, but you want to, the moment the signal is no longer too loud, you want it to release immediately. So you have a fast release. Or if you want it to release gradually and come back to the original volume gradually, then you would have a slow release. And after all this processing is done, the makeup gain is what you use if you want to, because if after all this work and the compressor's working a lot, then the signal is going to be lower as you wanted it to be. But once you've controlled everything and you like the relationship between the lowest volume audio and the highest volume audio on your track or your mix or however you're applying this compressor, once you're satisfied with the relation between the quietest and the loudest parts, you may want it to be louder overall. And that's what the makeup gain is for. All right. No compression. With compression. The meter is showing how much the signal is being reduced by the compressor. It's showing how much it's pushing back. This is interesting because okay, now you can hear that it's not responding fast enough to deal with the kick drum and all that low frequency energy, right? So you have to make it respond faster. And here, okay, so now it's working on the loudest bits. All right, we want it to come out at -3. Fine. But once we add the compressor, I've lost about 3 decibels of signal after I've been processing this thing. So let me add 3 decibels right here. Oh, still not enough according to the... All right, so now we can really compare the difference between them because we're going to be here listening to it at the same volume. This is without it. And with it. The one thing it doesn't seem to be interested in is the hi-hat. Like the hi-hat is just free to roam either way.
More punchy. With the compressor, the sound gets more punchy.
Yeah, I think it's the way it's responding to the kick drum. The kick drum definitely is. This thing's freaking out about the kick drum. It's freaking out over it, and I like that. There's another way of looking at it.
Do you mind changing the just to compare on your plugin? If you can, if I can see it again, you have the different type of compressors.
Oh, cool. Yes.
Can we hear the difference maybe with a higher ratio just to make it a bit more obvious?
Let's do it. All right, now let's see. Let's go to a faster one. So it's responding more. Yeah, it's about the same. This is based on the original Logic compressor plugin. Then you got the VCA where we were at. 15. It's like the AMEC. That's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like too slow to respond to the beginning of the kick drum, but I like what it's doing to the rest of it. It's really cool. That's the biggest difference I heard was with the opto. Too bad we don't have a tube option. Yeah, that's fun. All right, while we're here and while I'm commenting on the low frequencies, check this out. I'm going to send a 20 kilohertz tone. I don't know if you guys can hear this right now. I wouldn't hear it in, I can kind of hear it in my headphones. Just maybe it's psychological because I know it's playing. But on my speakers, I don't hear 20 hertz. But the equipment sure hears it. Look at that. Look the compressor's freaking out over a signal we can't even hear. It's not even a musical sound, and it's like the lower the frequency, the more energy there is, the more energy necessary to create it, and more energy emitted. So as you move up the spectrum, you see that the compressor works less. The compressor's working less now. Yes, we don't hear it either. But the fact is, like, the lower you go with the frequency, watch this. All right, that doesn't seem like a lot here, but it is. It really is, because what happens is whenever we're capturing sound, low frequencies are going to be a problem because they're just so much, it's not that they're louder to our perception, it's quite the opposite. I mean, it's much easier to hear a high frequency than a low frequency, but the amount of energy generated that the equipment just can't, it's working too hard to try and capture something that we don't get to appreciate anyway. So the old school way of recording to tape is to cut off like the low end, even from the bass, even from the kick drum, from everything. High pass filter. That would be this thing we'll get into. Well, I'll talk about EQ in a minute, but this would be a high pass filter right here. Now, kind of get the idea that, let's see. Now, I cut off a lot of energy there. I think we could probably measure it. Let me see. I see it coming in at minus 2.3. That kind of doesn't make sense right now. I think it's because the compressor's on. Wait a minute. Yeah. All right, so now we have, it's at minus 3. All right. In this case, it's behaving the way an EQ would, in the sense that by cutting off the low end, it's created more energy in the. So now the snare is making it actually louder. All right. So this doesn't prove my point at all. So I'm going to stop doing that. But the point is, if you record with less low end, the tape machine can accept more gain. And more gain in the analog world was a good thing. So what people would do is to not let anything below 80 hertz on the bass. And you'd think that's weird. And when you engage the filter, the signal of the bass went down by like 3 dB, you know, obviously because all the goodness was in the low end. So then you could raise the signal back to where it was. And that, what you printed that on the tape machine, on the tape, and you printed the kick drum like that on the tape, what happens is that when you played it back, you could add those frequencies below 80 hertz, and they would appear on analog equipment. They would be there. They would like blossom, you know? And I don't understand the physics of it, but you could cut it when recording, and by saturating the tape with more signal, you could reproduce those low frequencies when on the playback. So that's what people did to make, you know, louder is better. And it always is. I mean, it's you know, we talk about clarity, but at some point you can only achieve clarity with volume or you know, you at least, as long as there's a standard volume that people are adhering to in the world, you have to try and get the most out of it, and certainly not you know, so like one master at 0 dB and another, like two different songs are mastered to 0 dB, and one can sound louder than the other because of the harmonic content. Maybe it's the instruments, maybe there's distortion involved. They could be the same volume, but one can sound louder due to all the due to everything but gain. You know, it's like about presence of what harmonics you're hearing and how full is the arrangement. You can make something sound louder even though we work at a 0 dB ceiling. You know what I mean? All right, so let's talk about applications of compression that may not be obvious. I mean, the individual, I would think, would be the obvious, that you want, using the human voice as an example, you want to hear the lowest bits, and you don't want the highest bits to be too loud. So that's why we use compression. That's an easy one. There are other reasons to use it. There are other ways to use it. One, which is really becoming, it's always been important, but there are different applications for it now, and it's called ducking. Ducking is when you put a compressor on one instrument, but that compressor is not being triggered by the audio from that instrument. It's being triggered by the audio from a different instrument. And the classic use of ducking is on the radio. When the DJ is talking, he'll be playing some music in the background. He or she playing music in the background, and when they speak, the music goes down, and then you can hear it raise up again, and then they'll speak again, and volume goes down, comes back up. You can hear that the DJ is always clear, and that the music is being, ridden behind the voice. Okay. Now, some people could do that. I mean, before this technology was available, you would just have a mixer, and your voice is on fader 1, and a mono mix of the music is on fader 2, and you'd be speaking into the microphone and lowering fader 2 on the music when you wanted to speak. That's the easy way to do it. But you could automate this by putting a compressor on the music track, asking the compressor, linking the detector on the compressor to the microphone of the DJ, so that every time the DJ spoke, the compressor would compress the music track. That's our first use of ducking, and it's very practical, and we've probably all heard it at some point used this way. But then there are some creative ways to use it that are really cool as well. Such as, 90% of house music. Let me see if I think I have an example here. It's important just to hear it. As soon as you hear it, you know what I'm talking about. All right, this is a single note on a, wait, I don't want to give it away. All right. Simple note. Okay. There's a kick drum. You start with that. But now I've asked the side chain, the way you call, all right, the technique is called ducking, but what you're going to look for on the plugin or on the hardware is something called a side chain input, or some people call it a key input. So these are the two terms for the actual input used, and in the case of a plugin, you just tell it what track to listen to. So it's listening to instrument 1, which is a kick drum here. It's on the bass. It's on the bass note. It's listening to the kick drum. When you engage it, this is a cool technique, one, because if some people prefer doing this than to what I do to get the kick drum out over the bass notes. So you guys, I went into this at length yesterday, to where I go to make sure the bass doesn't happen. But some people just put a ducker on the bass line so that the kick drum always comes through. That's a quick fix. That would be practical, but what's really fun is when you play with the release and you find a musical place for the release. And I'm sure you guys have heard examples of this in real life, this use of ducking. This is the creative way to use ducking. A practical way that I use it in mixes, when mixing, is if the horn section has a part that is kind of stepping on the lyrics of the song, like maybe, I believe in two type of horn arrangements, or I classify horn arrangements into two types: American and European. Now, it doesn't mean that the Americans only do one and the Europeans only do one, but to me, the styles came from there. So the American horn arrangement is kind of like gets its ideas from African music, because it's about call and response. So what happens is that the singers sing, and then the horn players play when the singer's taking a breath. They don't play at the same time. Like, and you'll hear a lot of, there'll be some chords being played in the background and something like that. But for the most part, in what I call the American horn arrangement, there isn't any melodic material going on behind the voice. It detracting, taking attention from the voice. So, I'm going to sing my song, horns, horns, lyrics, ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba, lyric, ba, like one or the other. They're just like taking their place in the arrangement, right? So to me, that's like the American version. Now, the European version, you could call maybe more correctly like the German version, because it's based on polyphony. You get a lot of horn arrangements where there is a counter melody going on. There's like this whole other story going on behind the lyrics. It can be really cool, but it's harder for the mix engineer, because I have to make sure that that you can hear the lyrics without having to make it too loud. And So what I do is I put a compressor on the horns, and it's triggered by the lead singer. And that basically eliminates the problem. You know, you can still hear the horns. You have a very fast release, so you don't really hear the horns coming back. They're just back as soon as the voice is out. And that's a nice way to deal with something like that. And it doesn't have to be horns. It could be like a string section or anything with like a drawn out legato notes that could sort of compete with what's going on for the lead voice, you know? So like an organ, like a B3 organ or something like that, or just, you know, distorted guitar is another one. A really cool use of ducking that I thought was really exciting when I heard it. I didn't know what I was hearing, but it's, I don't remember which, but there's a Sex Pistols record where, you know, there's a lot of distorted guitar, but the kick drum, it's so easy to hear it. It never gets buried. And what they did is they were ducking the guitars with the kick drum. So like every time the kick drum came in, there was like this instant where the guitars weren't there. And you didn't notice because it was occupied by the kick drum. It's like this quick swap, you know? So but now that I said it, you could listen to a Sex Pistols record and hear it. You know, it's really fun. De-essing. De-essing exists because compressors, as much as they respond to low frequencies, that's how much they don't respond to high frequencies, because there's not enough energy to trigger the compressor. So when you're recording a voice and the more compression you use on the voice, the louder the S will become in relation, because everything else is being controlled by dynamics, either by compressor or limiter or a series of compressors. And every stage of compression, like the voice gets more controlled except for the S, except for the sibilants. Like it doesn't get touched at all by the compressor. It doesn't, you know, sort of doesn't even hear it. So there exists a compressor that only addresses high frequencies, you know, and you can choose exactly what frequency you want to compress. And that's what a de-esser is. It's a compressor that is made specifically to deal with S's, like 8 kilohertz, around that region. Groups, I mean, I have an application for group submixes, but I think, yeah, that's kind of like a gain staging issue also. It is a great way to create an architecture in the mix as an engineer, in the mix, that all your instruments are going to certain groups. So like all the drums have their own mix on bus 1 in stereo. So you can still control, you still have faders for every mic on the drum kit or drum machine or whatever you're using, samples and stuff, but all the drum and percussion information, you create a mix of that and you call that group 1. And group 2 would be maybe bass, and that would be it, like a mono group of like the bass instruments. Like if there's more than one bass, it would go out through the same output. Normally groups are good also for isolating instruments. So I like to have the bass on its own group. And then maybe the third group would be a stereo mix of the guitars. Fourth group would be a stereo mix of the keyboards. Fifth group would be a stereo mix of the horns. Stereo mix of the backing vocals. And finally, you have, you know, the fader for the lead vocal. And all of these groups are heading to the same output. And what it does is it gives you another stage, another gain stage to work with. And it provides a place for you to deliver more broad strokes, if you want to use painting terms. But the idea is that, you know, if once you have the mix the way you think it's right, but you would like to hear more voice, well, then you only have one fader for the drums, for all the drums and percussion. You know, you just drop that fader down a little bit and see if it's just too much drums. Or maybe, in my case, I usually wind up lowering the volume on the group of all the guitars and keyboards, because like I was saying yesterday, I think that I'm finding that those instruments don't really need to be so present in the mix for us to know they're there, because they're providing such a familiar function. Our minds sort of make up the rest, and that gives us more depth in the mix, and that gives us more sense of distance between the instruments and the effects and stuff. When these rhythm middle ground instruments aren't too loud, it can create a more depth in the mix, for example.
I've got a question.
Excellent.
A couple of questions.
Excellent.
When you mix, first of all, do you apply compression on your reverbs or effects? And if so, do you sidechain your effects, maybe with vocals or something like that? And then how do you add the perception of loudness in your mix? I'm not talking about EQ. I'm only talking about dynamics, compressors. The perception of loudness without being loud. And I'm not talking about EQ. How do you use your compressors or attack, release, whatever, to have this loudness without being loud? Do you know what I mean by that?
I think the only compressors that I have where I feel like they behave that way on their own, and I think it is an EQ thing, are the purples.
Okay.
Because the drums, they just sound louder when they go through them, because they sound more fun, and I don't know how to articulate that, but I do know specifically there is a 5 kilohertz. There's extra 5 kilohertz, like a bump there on these compressors.
Yeah, okay.
So that, I guess technically that kind of would be an EQ thing or a frequency thing. The sound of transformers I've learned that I like the sound of transformers more than tubes, with age, with experience. Anyway, I think, because the first thing that comes to mind is distortion. Distortion makes something sound loud without even raising half a dB on the signal. Because when you turn a sine wave into a square wave, it's generating all of these harmonics and just completely, fills up the timbre. You could put distortion on the drums. I've had people ask me to do that, and that's one way to make something sound loud without being louder.
So you saturate on the compressor the drums and then you put them in parallel compression?
I was going to get to parallel compression. That was my next.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was
sorry.
like my last application, but I'll get to parallel compression. But personally, I don't do those tricks, and I don't think people who work with me are looking for that necessarily. So I don't work very closely with distortion. You know what I mean?
Okay.
I can work with it, but I'm not good at creating that kind of, distortion that people are asking for so much. The closest thing I have a pair of distressors, and they are compressors that have a distortion circuit in them. But I use it more as a way of softening the sound rather than making it sound more aggressive. I find that distortion can be a great way to sort of tame a sound that's a little too aggressive, or when you think about like a guitar that's been played direct without an amp, it's got a kind of a cold, spiky ice pick kind of thing going on.
Yeah.
And one way to smooth that out would be to introduce some distortion. It's kind of the opposite of what you're looking for.
And you compress your reverbs or not at all?
I don't. In my case, I don't. I use outboard effects on the mixing desk, and they each have their own return. They each have their own fader on the desk, where I can throw them in pan or I can add EQ. I was experimenting somebody wanted that, and so I had to do it in Logic. I had to do it in the box, where I did exactly what you're talking about, like put an echo on something where you don't hear it when they're singing because you've reduced the signal, but the minute they stop singing, the echo is there, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lovely technique. I don't wind up doing it so much on my desk, but if I remember having done that, and it was the solution was in the box.
Okay, it's interesting.
Yeah, reverb, echo. It's a great way to get clarity. Another way for clarity, because the thing about reverb, it creates a perception of distance. So sometimes if somebody says, we wish the vocals were louder on a mix, sometimes instead of making them louder, I'll make them drier. I'll just turn down the reverb and it sounds closer. And I've achieved, clarity without actually having to turn up the fader, because and that could be psychological, or it might just be because the sound gets diffused with the reverb, right? And it's more, we're talking about clarity instead of volume. But sometimes when people say they want it louder, they just want it clearer.
And do you always keep in mind that it's going to go, the track's going to be mastered, so you got to be careful about not too over-compressed things?
Yes, absolutely. I over the years, I've wound up using more compressors and using much less of each of them. For example, when like the vocal chain, when I'm compressing the voice, like the lead vocal in a track, in the session, there will be, there are two options for compression. One I usually use, and it's not so much, it's the old timer, because I like the way the gain sounds more than, the compression itself, so it's very light, maybe not working at all. But then it leaves the box and it goes to what I do, and this is not my invention. It's a standard, industry standard, is to pair a slow compressor with a fast compressor for the voice. And the classic pair is the fast 1176 and the slow LA2A in series for the voice.
So first fast and then second slow.
Therein lies the debate. People have their preferences. I like fast first. Some people like slow first. It's question of taste. And to the point where I want to create a circuit here where I can just flip a switch and it reroutes
you can
the
A/B
sequence.
Yeah.
That can be done. But the idea is that the fast one gets the consonants and the slow one gets the vowels. It's really wild to watch it happen. Like, you don't need either of them to work on the whole word, the whole lyric. You just get one to engage on the beginning of, and the transients, and then the other one doesn't engage unless they've held a note, So it's like,
well, that's very interesting.
So like the fast one, it's like corazón, and and the slow one's going corazón. It's like they're responding to different parts of the lyric, and then neither of them have to work too hard, and they don't, and it just sounds lovely. You don't hear it happening. It just sounds naturally beautiful. I used to like the sound of compression more when I was getting started. I loved the sound of compressors, but now I really like, and I think we could call this old age. I just, I like clarity. I want to be able to hear. I want to be able to hear stuff. I want to be able to hear everything, and so there are tricks to doing that for and basically, a big part of mixing is just creating a hole for the vocalist.
And when bands send you their songs, are they then with compression, or do you get signals that are without compression or without effects at all?
If I have a choice, I ask for everything without processing of any kind. I want the raw stuff. If I have an option, but some people are in like there's this band that I convinced to work with a really great engineer in DC called the Loving Paupers, and I was like, I've worked with them for years, and I was like, you should really work with Sean Russell. He's got a great studio, and he's a really great engineer. And I know that they had problems with the previous record because they accepted an offer to record for free in somebody's studio. So they took a favor, and it dragged on for months, and the sounds weren't good. And I have no way of knowing how much it affected their playing, but it sounded like it was no picnic, So I convinced them to record, with Russell, with Sean Russell. And as far as I know, he'll use compression when he's recording. He likes to get these. He'll do that. He'll use EQs, compression. He'll commit to, but he's not committing to a particular sound, but however he's doing it, maybe he doesn't. I don't know. But whatever he's doing, I'm fine with that. I do ask for people not to record the reverb on their guitar amps or on their keyboard patches. If I have a chance, if I'm involved somehow in the pre-production, I'll ask people to do that. And definitely I'll ask them not to tune anything, because I'm only going to have to tune it again anyway, just to satisfy my ears. Okay, the other application, finally, Nico, where are you? Parallel compression. It's a technique where, let's say you really like the way the drums sound compressed, like that sound of the drums on Tomorrow Never Knows by the Beatles, like where everything is just like, it's like sizzling almost, and sounds loud, but it isn't that kind of thing. Let's say you're going for that and you've done it, but you also really want to hear the attack of the kick and the snare. You don't want to completely destroy those transients, So you want the effect of destroying the transients, but you still want the transients. The solution is parallel compression, and also known as New York City compression, because apparently it was invented there. But parallel compression is where you do have, let's say it's just a snare drum that you want to sound really smashed. Okay, so you have a mix of the drum kit in stereo, and you like the way everything sounds, but it sounds good. It's punchy, you like the volume of the snare drum, but you wish you could make the snare drum sound a little more raucous or something, like the sound loud, even though you don't want it to be loud. It's already loud, but it doesn't sound loud. So then you compress the snare drum on another track. So you have the normal snare drum in the drum mix, but then you create another fader, and on that fader you send only the snare drum, and you compress it the hell out of it. You compress the shit out of it, so it's all just like completely smashed sounding, and you blend that in with your natural signal, and that's called parallel compression. When you want to get the extreme sound of the compressor, but you don't really want to do that to the drums. You just want it to sound like it's being done in a way. And that was the old way to do it. And then comes the digital revolution. In digital production, now we have these compressors, plugins, and you'll see some of them have a mix knob, like this one. This is a digital invention, but it's basically what parallel compression is. A mix knob, so you can decide how much of the final output of what you're compressing is pre and post compression, or with and without compression. So you can do your own blend here. You can say, I want it to be 1-to-1, so I want want it to be one. Now that I got my smashed sound, I also want it to be, you know, kind of clean as well, so you can find that blend between the uncompressed and the compressed signal, which is basically what parallel compression is. And the beauty of this invention is that it's been reverse engineered for hardware now. Now you can find hardware compressors with this option where it was never available before. But now you can find some compressors where you can work the parallel compression right on the device and just decide how much of the compression you want to hear and how or not. You know, you can blend between the natural and the compressed. And that's something that was only thought of after it was done in a plugin. But now it's in the hardware physical world. It's really cool. It's one of those great moments for, you know, analog equipment. Because analog equipment doesn't stop being developed. It's like vinyl hasn't stopped being developed. When you think about, you know, ever since the invention of the jet, and we have jet airplanes now, that doesn't mean that propellers stop being developed. I mean, they still have, propeller planes still have their uses, and propeller engine technology has advanced a long way, you know, alongside the jet engine. Now you think about vinyl records, and the technology for pressing records has never stopped being developed. And records have never, vinyl has never sounded as good as it does in 2025. It's like, you know, I just wanted to put that aside there, that like, you know, the physical, the analog world is still keeping up and appropriating some of the best things that digital world has brought us, you know. That's fun to watch.
Part of Nico's question was about putting compression on effects. I'm not sure if I caught that or if that part of the question ended up getting missed.
You might have missed it. Basically, it's like a ducking technique.
Okay.
And it works really well on the lead vocal because, say the lead vocal is going to a reverb, but you really only want to hear the reverb when the voice stops, and you don't want it covering up the actual lyrics, you know. So what you do is you put a ducker on the reverb triggered by the voice, so when the voice stops, the reverb can be heard, and it's not muddying up the sound of the lead voice, you know.
Yeah, I use it a lot for rappers, for rap music or ragamuffin, when there's a lot of words, and in between words, when the singer breathe or whatever, then I've got a bit more reverbs or something like that, just to add dimension. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've done it, and maybe that's because over the years, I've definitely, you know, in 30 years, the volume of the effects on in my mixes has gone way down. It's gone way down. You know, it used to be like, wow, this sounds awesome, and then after the mastering, it's a bit, well, it is what it is, you know, and some people like that, you know, and it's interesting. You know, interesting doesn't cost us anything, you know. Good can be expensive, but interesting is free. We should all be thinking about how to make our music and our productions interesting, you know, until we have the money to make them sound quote unquote good. You know what I mean. When I try to use good and bad very with irreverence, because they're just opinions. And everybody's got one. You know, they're like necks. You know. Or like somebody once said, opinions are like assholes, and you don't share them with just anybody, you know?
And is there a let's say, a guide that you can recommend for us? If I mean, compression is being used on most everything in a mix, and the some everything is being compressed as well. Usually, is it and the different compressors to be used on different instruments and the voice. Would you? Is there a guide maybe that tells us which compressors to use on which instruments?
I think so. I'll try and dig that up. But I could say very quickly, the fastest ones are great on the mix. You want fast ones for drums, percussion, guitars. Not, the interesting thing about guitars is I don't see any need to compress distorted guitar. It's already been somehow, it's already been compressed. So I've never used compression on a distorted guitar. But I mean, a clean guitar has to be tamed sometimes, that initial transit. So you want something fast for that. For the bass, if you're playing the bass with a pick, you want a fast compressor. If you're playing the bass with your fingers, you can use a slower compressor.
Yeah.
If you're singing, fast is fun. For recording, I would record just a slight bit of compression on a fast compressor, just to make sure that the pops and nothing gets too out of control. Maybe nothing that I could hear, and maybe something that wouldn't engage unless person got too close or sang loud or something. But also a slow compressor is really nice on the voice. Slow compressors are great on horns, on backing voice. Piano is one of those things where I think you could get away with a slow compressor, because even though it's technically it's a percussion instrument, but because the hammers have felt on them, you're really not, it's not producing any kind of transient that's really gonna mess with the signal. I mean, a lot of compression is according to taste, and my approach using compression has changed. So it's hard to say. I mean, people use it as an effect because it sounds cool, like the megaphone effect on a voice, big in the 90s, that's a form of compression.
But if you use too much, it may sound dead. Makes the sound dead, or what is the problem?
Yeah. It can sound too, at best, it could sound too polite. Which is the word that I used when I learned to mix quiet, because I was mixing with a new engineer. At the time I was producing and not engineering. And he was listening at very, 85 dBs recommended. That volume is recommended because it's the volume where the human hearing hears every frequency equally loud. So we have, like, our ears have a flat frequency response across. It's the flattest it gets at 85 decibels. That's like the level where humans can hear everything at the pretty much the same volume, perceived at the same volume, so this guy was mixing at that volume, and then when I listened to the mixes later, they just sounded polite to me. There was nothing wrong with them, but there was nothing reaching out. There was, I didn't feel like they were making the speakers. It's fun when you feel like you're making the speakers dance or something, like that's kind of a fun moment when you feel like the speakers themselves are performing in a way. When you try and get the mix to treat the speakers as instruments, and I don't know how to get that, but dynamics are really important. So you don't want to remove the dynamics; you want to control them. So that and I think the big gain of using compressors is not that you can, tack down like the attack of things. It's not so much as that is that you can get more of the quieter bits. That to me is because you're basically just shrinking the margin between quiet and loud. And what I like is the benefit of hearing the quiet stuff. I don't need the loud stuff to be controlled necessarily. So it's a game. It's a game, and like I said, I use like instead of one compressor compressing 4 dBs on a signal, I would use 2, each one compressing 2, or maybe one compressing like 1.5 to 1 ratio, and the other one would be like a 2 ratio. Like each of them, and one would be a slow tack, and the other one would be a fast attack. Like the way I was talking about the voice, which I did not by any means. That technique is older than I am, I think. All right, not that old, but I was a kid when that shit was invented.
Talking about the attack, can you share any tips on that? Because sometimes I'm a bit confused on how I use the compressor in the attack of a compressor. So, I mean, on drums, I try to be with the tempo of the song or things like that. But any other tips you want to share, or
I think when I think of a musical response from the drum compressor, I think more about the release than the attack.
The release, yeah, sorry, yeah.
And the attack, I feel like let's see if I can demonstrate this. All right, for example, we got this kick drum, and let's say that it wasn't a sampler. This is the kick drum I got, and one way to deal with it, instead of finding another sample, would be to use a compressor. I'll use all right, you see, so the attack is at 0, so already you've destroyed the transient, the front of it. So let's open up a little bit. All right, so now what I want to do is to lower the volume on the tail of this thing. So I put the threshold up, put the release up, and I've dried up the kick drum by it. That's one way to use it. As far as like what we're doing is we're shaping the envelope. The envelope being like the beginning, the attack, and then the body of the sound as it tapers down to nothing. That's what we call the envelope. And there's ways to deal with, the front of the envelope, like here. All right, now all I'm doing is removing the beginning of the drum. But now I'll remove only so those 2 different shapes you're getting from what's called the envelope, the envelope of gain. Does that help? Is that one way to I mean, especially with percussion, with something that's consistent like that, you can really get in there and shape it, But it can be very cool with I mean, like sometimes we want to create more attack on an instrument or like on an instrument. But instead of increasing the volume on the attack, we could just work relatively and decrease what comes after the attack on the instrument, and then raise the volume on that instrument, So,
so basically, there is 2 ways of using a compressor. let's say, merge the lower sound and the up sound of a kick, for example, and the other part is to shape the envelope of the sound. So by let's pass the attack, for example, and keep the tail, or get down the attack and have the tail more.
Yeah, this is it's one way to work with it, you know, and it's part of, like, I mean, to me, it's almost like a creative use or a creative solution to getting, you know, something from an instrument that isn't quite there yet, you know, and but you know, it's a creative use, I would say. Someone might think it's a necessary thing. It's not creative, it's practical. But I mean, for me, practical is knowing that the kick drum will never get louder than minus 10 dB and will never get quieter than minus 12 dB. Like, that's important to me, to know that it's never, there's never going to be that one kick drum that surprises, that makes the, you know, I mean, there are times when dynamics are great, and there's times when you want to control them, and that's one way to do it, is with compressors. And it's, in a way, it's like automating the process, because now in the computer, I mean, this is the only way to do it, other than physically riding the fader. And some engineers were amazing at this, at just, you know, riding the fader for vocals is a very cool technique to do, to create presence in the voice. The idea is that instead of using all these compressors to get the voice to sit perfectly in the mix, you just learn the voice and you adjust the fader by hand.
So you use automation also. They use a lot of automation also with the digital.
Sorry?
They make automation also with the digital.
Yes, automation, right. Now it can be automated, you know, or even like the people who were doing it on the desk, you know, the desks had automation as well. It gets easier and easier. There are plugins that'll do it for you, you know, like ride the fader. One really cool use for riding the fader, even in 2025, is that, like, let's say, for example, I've compressed the voice exactly the way I want it. And now everything is the same volume. It doesn't sound squashed. It sounds natural, but every note is the same volume. Now, once we've gotten it where we want it to, we may want the voice to have we have to like add some dynamics back in after it's been treated. And the best place to do that is on the desk with the fader after all the compression's been done. Because if you automate the fader before the compressors are going to be trying to compensate for the automation. So the automation has to be done after the compression, so that you're not collapsing your structure every time, you know. So you've created a structure, and then you want that structure to have a little flexibility. You can write that in after the compression. Moving into EQs now, in relation to compressors, like the debate about which compressor goes first on the voice, the fast one or the slow one. The other big debate, and probably older, is EQ before or after the compressor. And people have their preferences. When I started working as a producer and engineering, like I started as a producer for years, I never touched a desk. I was just the producer. I was the liaison between the musicians and the engineer. I knew enough to be able to tell the musicians what the limits were, the technical limits. I knew enough to be able to tell the engineer what the musicians wanted and what they were going to be and what they would need. So that was my job. But once I started engineering, my preference was to put the compressor first. I wanted to get I wanted the sound compressed and seated. I guess you could use that word, seated, before adding tonal like options to it. But now I prefer to EQ. Now that in the digital world, since I'm doing subtractive EQ, I want to do that before it's compressed so that the compressor has to work even less. So like I was saying yesterday that, or even parts today, like that low frequency energy that we don't even get to hear and we can't even enjoy, it's making the compressor freak out. So I am doing my filtering before it gets to the compressor, and the compressor has even less to do. And it sounds even more natural, and then I'll use the output gain on the compressor to compensate for all the signal that was lost, for the gain that was lost with my insane combing down of frequencies, which I go a little overboard sometimes. But so my taste has changed, and I think it had to do with one was analog, it sounded cool. Now in digital, this sounds cooler. I'm never too concerned that the overall mix is going to sound too cold or lifeless, because there's something about the way the machines behave, and I believe in hysteresis, which is that machines, if they do the same job all the time, they sort of acquire a certain muscle memory. That's the only way of putting it. It's like they'll behave. That's why, like when someone else uses, all right, for those of you who remember what manual transmission is on a car, maybe you guys still have it, stick shift on the car. And then you lend it to your friend, and when you come back, it's all wonky. It feels all weird because they use it differently, and the stick shift got used to the driver, and you only used it in a certain way, and then another driver comes in, and then they use the same stick shift, and maybe they have problems with it. Maybe it doesn't respond to them, or maybe they break something in there. It's like the one time you lend your instrument to somebody and it comes back and it's like, how the hell did you do that? Like, how the hell did you break that? So that's hysteresis. It's a mechanical memory, and machines get used to operating in a certain margin, and they just get better at it, and they get worse at the rest, and they just get even better at what they're being used to do. I believe in that. I believe there's certainly hysteresis in mechanics, and I believe there's hysteresis in electronics as well. So once it's gotten it out of the box and it goes and it hits the toys, I should show you guys. Let me turn the camera. Here's my toy box. The Tower of Power. So mostly just pairs of compressors. And I create submixes in the computer. And I don't even have to fuss with the equipment anymore, because it's set to behave the way I want it to when it's hit with minus 10 dB of signal. So that's all done in the box. That's all done in the computer. So by the time the drums go to the purple compressors, for the compressors, it's like just another Tuesday. It's like the same old signal they're always getting, and they're just behaving the same. I don't touch them anymore. I don't touch the LA2A. The only thing I touch now are the distressors, because they're really good for that. They're really so versatile that the distressors are for fidgeting. And the mix bus compressor, it's on all the time, and it's at its lightest, slowest setting, because the thing is so damn fast. So like I got it set at its slowest, which is still faster than most. And the only thing I do with the mix compressor is that I mix without the makeup gain, and once I'm happy with everything, I add the makeup gain, and it just sounds better. I mean, there's never been a day that adding gain didn't made it sound worse. So by the time I've got the mix where I think it's like at 90%, 95%, everything is on the desk, then I'll raise the volume and just mix is kind of done at that point, you know. Sometimes, like I said yesterday about editing, sometimes I feel like maybe I've gone too far with the editing, but it doesn't sound like it, you know. Nobody's ever said, you know, it doesn't sound like me or anything like that. And I think in the same way, the way I'm always like, we're going into EQ now. The way I use EQ is pretty brutal, but you know, no one's ever said that sounds like, you know, like it's missing something, you know. I've never heard that. Sometimes people say, I want the guitars to sound a little more aggressive. And for me, that just means like giving back a frequency I already took away. And they're like, yeah, that's it. I don't have to add anything, really. I'm taking so much away. If somebody wants more, I just, you know, I give back. All right, EQs, really quick. There are 4 types of EQs. And I have like 1, 2, 3 types of usage, you know. All right, but the 4 types, one is the graphic EQ. That's the one we used to see in home stereos and on some bass amps, you'll still see this, where there's a little fader for each frequency. So the frequencies have been pre-selected as popular frequencies to add or cut. And you have a fader for each one, volume. So you can add or take away. That's the graphic EQ. And what's cool about it is that you can actually see the EQ curve in the faders. So people do like that. They're still very popular in live PA and big shows like that, because like when you're maybe you're used to seeing this, Nico, like there's something really cool. There's something good to know when you can see the EQ curve from a distance, and you know that, like, you know, the monitors have the same EQ curve, or you know, the front of house is, you know, there's something you can do in a general way that you can actually see what you've done, and you have like a visual representation of what you've done to the EQ. That's nice.
I use them to cut feedbacks on stage.
Oh, they're
500,
great.
1.25, you know. Yeah.
Is it my imagination, or is 250 a problem frequency on the stage? 250 hertz. Have you found yourself like 250 again?
200, yeah. 200, 300, 500, 800, 1.25, 2.8, 4K, 6.4, and then you got the harmonics or whatever, 8, 16 down. Yeah.
I know I have certain frequencies that I literally just don't like. And
same.
And it's not the room, and it's not, you know, Julie's like, me too. You've been there? Certain frequencies.
Yeah, completely. I hate F. I don't know why. And then when I'm singing, the volume is so big in my head. It's different from the other tones. So I hate F. I don't know why.
Oh, wow.
Well, I know why. It's because it's too loud in my head.
Because it resonates, like your skull was resonating to F.
It completely, exactly. And if I have to sing it the same way as the other notes, I have to just make it louder so the other people hear the same thing. But for me, it's just too big.
What a drag.
It's very strange. Yeah, it's super strange.
I've never heard that.
I knew I was hating that, and now I know why. But yeah.
Wow.
F
so
is
when
not
so
my...
but what about when you're listening? You're talking about when you sing it, but when you hear F, do you hear it better than
it's the same.
others?
I don't like it, but when I sing it, it's very because I'm singing as a soprano, and when there are easy pieces for soprano, the F is the note that you go to like all the time, and it's just awful to sing.
A parametric EQ is where you can select the frequency and you can select the gain and you can select what they call the bandwidth or the Q. All right. Those are parametric EQ. Another type of EQ is called the shelf. And that's where you decide at what frequency everything below, if it's a low shelf, it will raise everything. So as far as shelving EQs go, there are two kinds. There's the low shelf and there's the high shelf. And I'm not going to tell you how to use them, but you should use them and pick a favorite. And you can always change your mind later, you know, but I don't want to influence you guys in how to apply these, or how I use them isn't necessarily how you guys ought to use them, but you should be aware of these options. And the other one is the filter. You have the high pass filter, which I demonstrated before. They're called two things. This is called a high pass or a low cut. So you might see one or the other in your travels. And so it's high pass, low cut. The other being the low pass and or high cut. It's the same thing. One application for a filter, a practical application, would be in film when you've got, you know, somebody who's outside the nightclub and then they open the door and go into the nightclub. So you got this like opening of the high frequencies that simulates that going on. It's like you're outside the club, then you open the door and you're in the room and you got the treble next to you. So that's a very quick, you know, there are musical applications like crazy. I'm sure you guys have heard plenty of examples. All right, I think I'll just demonstrate my seek and destroy method. So now the gain's peaking at around 9.5. But without the EQ. So yeah, that's like a loss of 3 dB right there. And what I would do after that would be to add the old timer.
I just have a question.
Yeah, please.
On those type of EQ, there's always a grid behind. You see the grid with those vertical lines, and it's the way they're spaced. It's completely different. What's the purpose? Is it because you need to be? Is it in relationship to the cue, or you?
I think I can answer that.
Cool.
I'll try.
I
you tell me. Okay, it's about it's a logarithm scale, actually. And that's exactly the thing you showed me the first day with the numbers that are not going like linear. The middle of what we hear is not the middle. It's just it's the way this is working. It's the logarithm scale, actually. How can I say? And it's the same for decibels, and it's the same for the frequency. It's just the idea that when you have an octave, you have less numbers in between, and then well, actually more, and then less, and that's the idea. The same thing. It's the sound is working like that, not linear, but logarithm.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. That's
the only thing I know about it.
That's great, because I mean, even the overtone series, I guess we could say, has sort of a logarithmic.
Exactly. That's it.
Curve, right?
That's exactly. Cool. That's the way it works.
Everything is logarithmic.
Wow.
Even
Sorry?
light. Everything is logarithmic in life. Light is the same thing. Sound.
About all the frequencies, these kind of things, because light and sound is the same thing, just not on the same place. But yeah.
Whoa.
That's why we use the white noise and rose noise.
Pink noise.
Pink noise.
Pink, yeah.
You put red as a.
So those vertical lines we see on the plugin, on the EQ plugin you just displayed, Vic, that's what you're talking about, Julie.
Yeah, exactly. I can search that a little bit more, but it's something with the.
Okay.
It's something about the tones and things like that.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, I if you want, I can find that again, but perhaps not in 2 seconds. But yeah.
Yes, you're right. It's logarithmic scale, because the more the more you're going to the high, the more frequencies you have. So you need to have this scale, or have a really big AQ. Because as you see, from 2 kilohertz to 10 to 20 kilohertz, it's take the same place as from 20 hertz to 1 kilohertz.
Yeah.
Roughly.
Okay, I thought it was an indication for the ears, to be careful in those areas when they, for example, the 4, 500, they're close to each other instead of the 5 and 800.
No, it's just about the sound. Yeah.
Okay. Because everything happened in the magic happens in the mids, so it was just a way to show you how to be a bit more detailed. Let's say it like that.
Actually, if we put so I can explain now. I know what to say. It's no, I know. It's because you see, you have we can see it on this, actually. You have the 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, 90, 100, and they're not spaced regularly. because if you space them regularly, you will have a small place for the frequency between 0 and 100, and a very big space between for the frequency between 10K and 20K, because it's huge, the difference, if you compare to them. But if you want to look at them as we hear them, like for us, it's the same, because it's the same kind of difference in the sound that we hear. You have to put all this on one scale, where you can see that this distance between 0 and 100 is more or less the same distance as the one you have between 10K and 20K. That's more or less the idea. Well, actually, it's...
Or 2 kilo and 3 kilo is the same distance.
Yeah, exactly. When you double... Yeah. When
you have exactly the same thing.
Times it... Yeah. When you times it by 10, it's the same distance. When you times it by 10, it's the same distance. And then so between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in between, you don't have the same distance. And that's the logarithm scale. So you can put everything on the same drawing, and the distance that are represented are the ones that we can hear.
Makes sense.
Goes with it. Yeah.
Good. Cool.
Fascinating.
Sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. No, actually, the first day I was like, will he say logarithm at one point or not?
I was thinking of talking about Fibonacci, but I left it alone.
Yeah, it's different. Yeah.
That's fascinating. That's really cool. And that is something I was pondering at, like the first day, I think, was talking about this ponderous. How,
you were talking about it
I'm going all the way around it. I just never said the L word.
And yeah, exactly. But that's I'm a math teacher, and student don't believe me when I say that math is everywhere. But yeah, it's just that when you don't know the words or the ideas, you don't see them. But yeah, if you know that, it's just logarithm,
I know what rabbit hole I'm going down tonight. I know what I'm going.
I'm sorry.
I wish I was better at math, but I literally chose between math and music when I was like 15. And in fact,
same for me, but I'm trying to go the other way around now.
Right on. Well, you're going to be very successful. I mean, you got this shit done, especially in engineering. You're ahead of us.
Okay.
That's really cool. So now you guys have seen what I do when it comes to subtractive EQing and how it works. Let me find
just a question, Victor. When you were seeking and destroying, you were exaggerating certain frequencies, or you did like a sweep, didn't you? And then you were pinpointing the frequencies that were ringing the most. Is that right?
Yeah. In this case, the ones that I thought were exaggerated, either. But like right now, I want to find another instrument to do that to, because I think it would make more sense if you heard it like on an acoustic guitar, if I can find one.
But why is that? Is because you want the sound to be like flat, or because it's part of the timbre of the instrument, or?
Well, sometimes I think there are many reasons why I would eliminate a frequency. One would be it's the sound of the room and not the instrument, which is why I'm looking for an acoustic guitar right now. Then you could hear that like there are certain sounds that get captured on the mic. Joe knows this very well, that are not, it's like the proximity to the mic. It's not the way people hear the acoustic guitar. Or sometimes you can hear, like a frequency might be too loud in the space where they are playing. and it's not a note that it corresponds to the either it doesn't correspond to the instrument, or it doesn't correspond to the tone, the key signature of the song, or maybe it's a frequency that I think I would rather hear in the voice. So those are three different considerations for deleting a frequency.
Also, to leave room for other frequency in other instruments, for example.
Right, like when I talk about making a hole for the voice, one way I do that is with EQ. Another way I would do that is like ducking the horns is a way of defending the space of the voice. Another way is by panning instruments out to the left or right so that they're not competing with the center information, which is the snare drum, the voice, the kick drum, the bass. These instruments are always in the middle in the mix.
Do you use the same technique with all the instruments that have? If you want to make place for the bass, so you keep some frequencies away on the kick to leave place for the bass. When you have two instruments that have the same frequencies,
absolutely,
low frequencies for them.
Absolutely. Let me find out. I think I found the mix. I'll do this first, Nico, and then I'll address the kick and the bass, because that's definitely needs to be talking about. All right, so let's look for tones that aren't really, notes, let's say. Now here's a tone that just keeps going no matter what the chord is. It's the same note, So it's just a buildup of a frequency, either in the room or in the space between the mic and the guitar, but it's not a note coming, you know what I mean? It's like it's excess, and it's getting in the way. It's not changing with the chords. So that's gone. And because there's a voice in this song, the low end is already, pretty or not, it's out of there. Yeah, that's gone. Yeah, and if I don't like 1K, I'm not going to like 2K, right? Although that is there's something about that on this guitar that that's something about the character of the guitar. But I'd rather that frequency went to the voice. And I'll add another one.
So you always
then to get back the signal, I pop in the old timer. All right, so maybe that's a better example of,
And then when you
finding the stuff that doesn't really,
when you subtract frequencies like that, you're always that drastic about like 10 dBs, 15 dBs. That's a lot, no? And I see on your channel you have like 3 EQs.
Well, I had already done this mix, so I was just doing this one in front of you guys, but the EQs that I wound up doing for the mix are these first two plugins. So let me take those out. That was just to show you what it did. And I wound up not using a compressor because it was going to what I call the skank bus, which is like all the pianos and guitars. I make a sub mix of all the pianos and the guitars on this track, and I sent them to the pair of distressors, where I was able to treat them as their own mix, sub mix. So, and when that's the case, I wind up not using compressors on the guitars. I don't use them so much except on the mix of the guitars with the keys and all that together. But what I had done was this. And this one too. Now, it's hard to say at what point I arrived at these EQs, because I will start out by really drastically going into it, right? Not so much on this plug, because it's a little more musical than the Logic one, and I feel like a little goes a long way on this plugin. But still, I'm taking things down by like 4.5. This is down by 7, 5.
And when you EQ, you always EQ in solo mode, or?
I do. It's not always recommended, but because some people, well, you will hear, and I respect this opinion. Some people, I've heard mix engineers, the best of them, the best of the best, say, first of all, they say, I never spend more than 4 hours on a mix. And 2, they say, I put all the faders up at unity gain, and I mix with everything already in. And I mix everything relative to what's going on. Now, I got 2 things to say about that. One is, these people have an assistant. If they're working 4 hours, they're walking into the room after their assistant has spent 4 hours on the mix, and they already know the routing, and they know what compressors the guy likes, and they know, the thing has been sorted. Like any issues are sorted by their assistants, and then they come in with fresh ears and they get to listen to a prepared mix. I don't have that luxury, so I spend 8 hours to mix because I am my assistant. And they're working. But there were 2 things. It was that. Oh, the other thing is, in most music, people aren't expected to make remixes or dub versions, and people come to me are expecting that. They're expecting to hear, a dub mix once the the main mix has been approved. Then I'm free to create remixes, and of course I would, because I've just spent all day learning a song, and it's on the desk, and there's no better time to do a remix than when everything is in place. So I do live dubs. I mean, just think, you've spent 8 hours on a tune. What's another 3 minutes? And then you make a version. And then what's another 3 minutes after that? Spend another hour after 8 hours spent, making remixes, one of which might beat the mix that was approved. So you might just hit on, and it's happened. I've hit on arrangements. So now when I've finished a mix and the mix has been approved, the first thing I do is print the stems. You got to print an instrumental version of the song, You have to print the a cappella of the lead voice, and you print the backing vocals. Those 3 elements, bare minimum. You definitely, as soon as a mix has been approved, before you do anything, well, you hit save, and then you print out an instrumental track without the ducking. You print out the a cappella, and you print out the backing vocals without the ducking. This is because
sorry. What does print mean in this?
Record, make a bounce of,
make a bounce.
To print. I guess print is sort of an archaic word. It's sort of a tape or film word, Yeah,
and the stems have the effects in them.
Yes.
Stems. Okay. I see.
Yeah, it's. I'm simply muting the voices when I do the instrumental track, and it runs through the desk just as, and the same for the vocals and the backing vocals. There are so many applications for these things. Let's say, and this has totally happened, like a song that I mixed got placed in a TV show. An episode of Breaking Bad or something like that. And they only needed the instrumental version. Boom, you got it. Or somebody wants to remix the song, but all they want is the a cappella. Boom, we got that. Let's say you're going to play on stage for television, so you need a backing track. So you need the backing vocals and the instrumental track. Boom, you got it, and you sing live. Great. Let's say you're playing a live show on stage, and the drummer's working with a click track and programs, and that's very common these days. And you just need the backing vocals. So boom, you got that, because you don't have, it's cheaper than hiring the vocalist, and it's more practical. So those are some applications. And of course, at mastering, let's say you're at the person goes to the mastering and they're like, what, we really wish the voice were louder. You can do that. You can have the mix that was made and then make another fader with only the a cappella, the same voice, and you just blend in as much, like 1 or 2 dB of that. You get it right where you want it. So, or conversely, the vocal's too loud, so you use the instrumental track and you use the a cappella and you draw down. It saves asses, really does. And people don't even ask me to do it. I just do it, and they're surprised when they get it. I always deliver a backup of the whole tune, track by track, including all the processing and editing and stuff. I always deliver more than people are expecting. And I hang on to the backups as well. That's as far as building loyal clients and stuff. When somebody calls you and says, "You remember that project 5 years ago? Is there any chance you still have that thing?" Totally not expecting it. And when I do, they're like, "You're a hero. You saved the day." It's a good feeling. And then you've gained a client, for life. Or at least you've gained great recommendations from this person. So yeah, once the mix is approved, I might try another mix where I think, well, let me see if I can do something conventional that, now that you like this, I'll give you another one that I thought, I personally think the snare could be louder, so I'm just going to do that. You can have it. And then I print the stems of the mix they wanted. And then I'm free to do remixes, and I'm free to mess with the board and twist the knobs and send, change the reverbs around. And a lot of times when I do the dub remix, the first thing I do is, instead of the drums being stereo on 1 and 2, I'll send only the kick drum to 1 and everything else to 2. So it's mono drums, and only the kick drum is not being, this kick drum's been separated because that's the one thing I wouldn't, necessarily want to send to the reverbs or the echo or something like that. I want more control with the kick drum. And then I just start dubbing away, or maybe I'll just leave the mix exactly as it was not mess with the vocals. For the first 2 versions, I won't touch the vocals or the horns or the backing vocals, and I'll just play with the rhythm section. And every once in a while, one of those, live improvisations on the mixing desk becomes the arrangement that they choose for side A, or, like the official track. It's happened. So it's worth trying, especially because it's an analog setup and I don't really have recall abilities. I don't want recall abilities. I don't want that kind of work. So by the time I'm done performing my service, my craft for the client, then I get to be an artist again for an hour, And then the mix is gone forever. I mean, it's forever, no longer on the mixing desk, and all you have are your backups and your stems. Okay, I think I've talked about EQ enough, unless you guys have questions about it. The stereo field.
I've one question concerning EQ. You talked about having using ribbon mics in the digital world, and what is the difference between using ribbon mics and using condenser mics and EQing them in a way that they sound like they behave in a way like ribbon mics?
I think it's difficult to make a condenser. I don't know if I've ever even tried this, to make a condenser mic recording behave the way a ribbon mic recording would behave.
Okay.
I use EQ on both of them for sure, but for different reasons. Like if the condenser, if we're talking about the voice, right away, if it's a condenser mic, I know I'm going to want to control like the high frequencies because there are going to be plenty of them. Definitely the S, Now, if it's a ribbon mic, I know I'm going to want to use the shelf on the low frequencies and take out the low frequencies, because the condenser mic, in general, condenser mics have an excess of high frequencies, and in general, the ribbon mics have an excess of low frequencies. But you only need to take away the excess to hear the rest of it and hear that there really is a balanced, I just approach them differently. Mm-hmm. One thing that's cool about using a ribbon and a condenser mic together on the lead vocal is that they seem to capture different things, much in the way a fast and a slow compressor captures different parts of the voice. I feel like, the ribbon mic is great on the vowels and the tone, and the articulation is all on the condenser mic. So I've blended both types of mics on the lead vocal with, with great results. Definitely. Sounds warm and articulate. It's great. It's about the best of both worlds, But as far as EQing goes, yeah, they both, I do a lot of EQing, as you've seen. I'm definitely drastic with it. And I'll start off by just killing these frequencies. But later on, once the mix is on the desk and I'm listening on to the my favorite speakers and it's in the analog world, sometimes I'll say, all right, I think I went too far on the guitar. There's room for more of those frequencies, and I'll ease up on them. I'll bring, maybe I'll give back half as much, or sometimes when I think I've gone too far, I'll just bypass one of the, like if I have like 2 EQs on something, once I got the mix, I'm like, yeah, there really is room for more guitar in this mix, and I'll just bypass one of the EQs and problem solved, So I have no problem going back and undoing what I've done. But to start with, and the reason I work in solo is because as a remixer, there's going to be a moment, there could be any moment when the guitar is solo, That's something that a pop mixer never has to think about. They're just thinking about the whole, the result, that like the sum of all parts. Whereas I'm in this business of deconstruction, and so at any point it could be just the bass, or it could be just the voice, or it could be just a guitar, you know, and that happens on the fly. That's improvised in my case. So why not, you know, eliminate all surprises, all nasty surprises, and just clean these things up in solo? Because in my world, there's always a chance they will be in solo, you know. But yes, a conventional mixer would not think like this, or you know, would not recommend it, you know. I mean, it's one thing to work a live PA and to say, let's hear the kick first and let's hear the other thing first, and just build, because you want that kind of control, especially on a stage, because, you know, humans are unpredictable and you never know what could happen. So you do want that kind of control. But people who mix records say, well, you know, nobody's going to hear it like that, so why would you want to hear it like that? But in my case, they might.
Joachim, sometimes what I do is, for example, on a voice, when I use a U87, it's I take a plugin, an EQ plugin, and I remove the 2K, 2.8K, like drastically, because they just don't sound good or too harsh. And then I put another plugin after compression, like a Pultec or something like that, and I boost the same frequency again. But because it's a different EQ, it adds more warmth to those same frequencies, and they're not as harsh. I found out that I use EQ like that also. Same on the Pultec, sometimes you can diminish the 60 and then boost the 60.
Yes.
Because the way it gives a pump or something, the way the machine is done, I don't know how to explain it. It's just little tricks.
Yeah, the mechanics of a Pultec in particular, I think they're called induction EQs, you know, a lot of tubes and stuff, I believe. I'm actually not even sure there are tubes or how many. But the way they work, that you can create like some harmonic effects with them in a way. Like this, there was this, what they call the 1K trick. And it was basically you boost and cut 60 hertz.
Yeah.
And it creates this sort of harmonic response.
It gives that little punch in the bass.
Yeah.
It's good.
It, like the way it's dealing with it creates a sound of its own, and that's fantastic. And that's why people like particular pieces of gear. It's not like every EQ is the same, especially in the hardware world. You know, the way they're built, like compressors, they're all built differently to do the same job to some extent. You know, but they're coming from all different directions, and EQs are much like that. And there was a time when digital music was only, you know, digital production was really in its early stages. You would say, well, there are plug-in and there's hardware. But now the plugins were really great at emulating the behavior of these different impulse responses, and it's come such a long way in 20 years. It's really amazing, you know. So yeah, you grab a nice Pultec EQ and it will create that same behavior that the hardware does. It's fun. I exaggerated that stuff, and then it, you know, I mean, that can be overdone, of course, like anything. Talking about panning, there's not too much to talk about, except it just needs to be thought about, I guess. And one thing I would say, like I think I've said before, beware of stereo information. Beware of those stereo patches on the keyboards. Too many stereo pairs of microphones or too many stereo loops, one on top of each other. They all these different stereo fields start messing with each other. They're all supposed to sound great in solo, but when you stack them on top of each other, multiple ambiances, they start masking each other. They start creating gaps in one sound and phase issues, and they can start canceling each other's frequencies. It can be messy really quick and difficult to mix something like that. What I like to do is get as much mono material as possible in the mix, and I create the stereo image. You know, I want to be the one to create the stereo image, so I want mono sources. You know, Sure, a couple of things I want in stereo would be, you know, the overheads on the drums. I would want, depending on how many instruments there are in the mix or something, but if somebody has like a Hammond organ, you know, it would be nice to hear that in stereo if there's room for it in the mix, but sometimes not even that, you know? So I would rather so I'm making stereo mixes with mono sources, and I avoid the stack of pizza thing. Like I think I said yesterday, you know, you think of like each sound, you only need a piece of it. Not only vertically in terms of EQ, but horizontally in terms of space. You only need a piece of each instrument to fit into the mix. You know, they might sound kind of wedge shaped by themselves, but you know, there's another instrument that's compensating for it. You know, so there's, you know, if the bass is very prominent in a song, then you probably don't want too much low end coming from the keyboards or for the acoustic guitar. Between the kick drum and the bass, going back to what I was talking about, Nico. This is the kick drum, high pass at 100, and this is the bass guitar. Wait, this is the kick drum, and this is the bass guitar. You know, and when you hear the bass, you can see it's not really even getting close to 30. Whereas the kick drum did have some information below that it had a lot of sub information that we weren't going to hear it anyway. Now I would say conventionally, it's the opposite. I think I talked about that yesterday or the other day, whereas it's usually the kick drum that occupies the bottom of the frequency spectrum and parts of the top, you know, all along, depending on the kind of kick drum. And it's the bass that is above the floor of the spectrum, above the kick drum. But in reggae and in many forms of dance music, it's the opposite, where the bass is more prominent and has a melodic function, and it is what moves people's hips, whereas the kick drum is more about hitting us in the chest, you know, for a reference. So that's how I deal with them, is just choosing, I mean, amongst other things I do for the EQ, like in the case of the bass, I mean, I definitely, you know, took a few frequencies down. Not with the kick drum. Oh yeah, with the kick drum, yeah, I took one thing that was bothering me, took it out. Didn't use the compressor. In the bass, I used a little bit of compression. Right, so I just added that to compensate for what I was taking off the bass. As far as panning goes, dead center is almost like 1K as far as panning goes, because it's like the obvious, easiest to hear. It's the reference. And so what we want in the middle are things that, like non-directional things, like the bass and the kick drum. We want that in the middle because how do I put this? Musically, I mean, it doesn't matter which side you put them in, musically speaking, because we're just going to hear it no matter what, and we're not really going to hear the direction. So in that sense, it doesn't seem to matter. But technically, it does matter. And even if we weren't going to press vinyl, it's easier to get a louder, optimized mix if the low frequency information is in the center and not skewed to one side. And what I prefer to put on the sides and the wider, I would put them pretty much according to frequency in a way. I think like the overheads, I always have wide open panning, so like the cymbals and all that, the highest frequency, we want to hear that image, the directions of that. And then if there's percussion like tambourine or shaker or something like that, I would also maybe not as far out, but in, on the outskirts of the mix. And then the guitars and the pianos and the keys, they would get closer, and maybe like 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock settings on the pan, and then closer in for like the horns maybe. And then and that's really a choice. If there are a lot of backing vocals, you might want the backing vocals, if they're like very airy and stuff, then you want them to be wide open, and the horns maybe more centered, narrower stereo field, and of course the lead voice in the middle. So there are many reasons to do that. I think I'm able to build depth in a mix with panning. So on my groups, on my mix groups, on the drum mix, the panning is wide open. It's all encompassing. On the guitars and the keyboards, the guitar and keyboard mix, submix that's going to the desk is like 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And that makes it sound a little closer. And the narrower you go with the stereo fields, the closer it sounds in the mix. So you can create depth that way. And if you want to, and depending on the volume of the horns, if they're rather quiet or something, you might want to pan them out really far to create like this background of horn, to create a sense of distance. And of course, the lead vocal and the snare, and you don't want distance between those things in the mix. You want those touching your nose when you're listening to the speakers or something. But like the backing instruments, you can create a distance between the voice and the guitars and the keys by how far, by adjusting, the width. The width, can create depth. I think I said that enough. But and also the effects. The effects I like. They don't have to be hard panned all the way out, but they have to be on the ends, on the periphery. And as far as effects go, I like to put, I think I mentioned this yesterday, I create an environment with 4 mono effects. I use a mono delay on the left, short, mono delay on the right, long, mono reverb on the left, long, maybe a spring, mono reverb on the right, kind of short, or a plate or something. I might want to change the types, the quality of the behaviors of the reverbs or something. But basically, you've got bright, dark, long, short, gotten a combination of these things. And I imagine them as like corners on the screen of like a cinematic, when I try and visualize the mix, even though I'm not working with height or anything. But and then I have 4 sends for each instrument, and they each can go to one of these or the other, or none, or all of them. Sometimes I like when the guitar is on the left and the reverb for the guitar is on the right. Or maybe if there are 2 guitars, I'm going to want the reverb on their respective sides. So I like to create stereo images by balancing instruments and balancing frequencies. So in the sense that if you have a shaker, I would put it on the left and then look for something complementary on the right in that frequency. And I've had producers record a tambourine at the mix session just because we got a shaker, but we need something on the right side now, and we'll just create some sparkle on the right side. And I've seen that decision made at the mix session. You'd be amazed at what kind of decisions we can make, now, and we, it's so now that it's nonlinear. I mean, I've had the mix like 95% there, and everything's like really where I want it. And if it's my production, I can say, you know what, the bass line should be simpler, and I'll just pick up the bass and like, now it's easier to mix because, there's less notes. And that's something I learned as a bass player, as a mix engineer, is that the less you play, the louder you can make it in the mix. So that's, if you want to be heard, play less. It's paradoxical. But in the mix, especially for a bass player, the less notes you play, the easier it is to mix. So with reggae, there's a real charm with these, 4-note ostinato bass lines that just, they're so, you don't even need a compressor, because you can look at the EQ. If it's 4 notes, you're dealing with 4 frequencies. And you can just see, each one's, are they all the same volume now? Yeah. Who needs a compressor? It's beautiful. How did I get into that? Stereo effects. Creating the stereo image with mono elements, and that includes. So I don't use stereo effects. I don't want the computer telling me what stereo is. I want I want to do that. So I use mono effects in stereo. I'll use a mono pair, and each one will have a slightly different quality, so that the sound. I personally like when the image goes from left to right. That's a personal preference. So I like that. Like if the snare, I'll put the short reverb on the left and the long reverb on the right, and the snare will touch both of them, and the sound, the tail will move from left to right. There are other ways to play with stereo image that I really like. One is when you record the drum set, instead of using a stereo pair, of overheads, like condensers or something. One time I did this, and I don't know why I do it more. I don't do it more. But I use this, like when recording the vocals, and you use one ribbon and one condenser, and they're exactly the same distance from the voice, and then you can blend it. I did that with the drums once. I used one ribbon mic and one condenser straight above the drum kit, looking down at the snare. And then at mix time, I put the ribbon mic on the right side, and I put the condenser mic on the left side. And you could hear the image moving from left to right, because the ribbon mic is slower than the condenser, and it behaves differently. So like a cymbal splash had this really yummy kind of like kind of thing going on to it, That can be fun. But I mean, that's, you make the stereo. Don't let, don't let the patch make the stereo for you. A lot of times they make the stereo by screwing with the phase, and that and that can be a real problem. And the best way to measure is, that's why, one of the important things to have in your toolkit, and I think most programs come with it, is a correlation meter. It's not intuitive. It's not like 0 is where you want to be, or 0 is mono. In fact, mono is when everything is so in phase, it's at +1, it's not even moving. So like if it was just the snare drum, it's there. But like full stereo would be like up to 0, like full natural stereo. But then if you cross into the left, that's the danger zone. So you have a signal, you want to make it stereo because it sounds interesting when you make it stereo. So you could go, let's see, imaging, stereo spread, go from mono to stereo. It's using phase misalignment to do this. So this is what it would look like. All right, there's your mono bass. All right, so maybe that move would be acceptable. But here's the thing: you don't want to take it be too crazy with it. It's nice. You would want this on your mix. I think a mastering engineer would have one of these to check the mix, just for some really insane craziness. But basically, like if the stereo drums are crossing over the zero, that's really okay, because when you sum it with all this mono material, like the bass and the lead voice and stuff like that, the sum of the mix will be well in the green. It's not going to be an issue. But just to show you what it looks like when something has gone out of phase, or what it sounds like, you know. So a lot of these patches and effects are made by using this kind of phasing trickery, and they can wind up canceling themselves when they're folded into mono, which is, you know, the main reproduction these days. I mean, it's nice that probably more people listen with headphones, earbuds now than ever before, which is great for people who like to work with stereo and Dolby Atmos and really get into the stereo field. There's definitely a place for it. It's not like people are just listening on their phone. That's convenient, but a lot of people still listen on earbuds. So as monocentric as my production values are, I would, you know, grain of salt. Take it with a grain of salt, because stereo is very interesting, and I use it more of a musical way, I think, than a technical stereo image. You know, I think I'm looking for movement in a certain way, and just certain behaviors in the environment, and that's why I like to have, you know, just the same bank of effects that everyone uses, rather than adding reverb on each instrument. You know, I was called in to fix a mix, and the first thing I did was to bypass all the reverb plugins. There was one on every backing vocal, like stacks of vocals, and drums, tons of, you know, tracks of drums, and they each had their own reverb plugin. And then I understood why the engineer got fired in the middle of the session, and I got called in, you know, like, help. So I was like, all right, well, what's all this? All right, let me just, as soon as I bypassed all the reverbs, and I hit play so I could hear what was going on, they're like, oh my God, that's so much better. What'd you do? It's like, oh, okay, you know, I just had to remove, remove the confusion, right? Just brought clarity to it. So in that sense, I much rather have these effects. If you're working in the box, you put them on their own separate bus, and they're going, maybe they're returning to their, right to the output, you know, straight to the output, or maybe have them going straight to whatever vocal group you're using. But I wouldn't even get into group environments. I would save the environment thing for like the final mix, like for the final output. I wouldn't get gain stages, you know, with the effects and stuff like that. And especially thinking about how it's going to sound in the master. You know, I'm much more light-handed these days, and I recommend being light-handed with the mix, with the effects levels in the mix, because they will get louder. Stereo. All right, some programs, I believe Pro Tools has this, but it's good to know what it is. It's something called pan law. Pan law is a way that mixing desks are able to make more of the stereo field by creating sort of a concave image. And by doing that, They do that by whenever something is in the center, it's 3 decibels quieter than it would be on the outside. Like the more you pan to the right, it will get louder by 3 decibels by the time you pan. That's called pan law. And it's a way of maybe just accentuating or the stereo image. And I imagine mixing desks all have their own different pan laws. There might be some standard, but what's cool in Logic is that you can choose, you got a lot to choose from. -3 dB is that if it's in the center, it's 3 dB quieter. That's the least extreme. And that's probably like what most mixing desks are like, at least. The next one is -3 dB compensated. And what's happening is that it's down, it's -3 dB in the middle, plus 3 dB on the sides, on the ends. And then more exaggerated is 4.5 dB down in the middle, 4.5 down the middle, plus 4.5 on the sides, and then 6 and 6, you know. This, you know, so it'd be like a difference of 12 decibels here. On the compensated, it's twice as much. And depending on what you're doing, if you're film scoring, you know, or if you're doing something in the box and you want to deliver, you know, once you're happy with the mix, this is something I would just experiment to see, you know, which one you like. I keep it at, you know, the vanilla setting. You know, I like it there. But maybe if there's a lot of, like I've you know, if it's a pop song and it's got all the conventional instruments and a string orchestra, I may want to do something there because it won't affect the it affects the outputs, but I use my outputs like groups, so it would still, you know, before it gets to the mixing desk, that could be something that could sort of tidy up or create more space as a last move, you know, just to audition. And I believe Pro Tools has that option. So that's a nifty thing people don't talk about.
I have a question concerning the effect of the main vocal. Is it? I mean, you want to have it in your face, I guess, and so do you use a pre-delay then, so that the effect comes later, or how do you achieve it?
Again, like, since my effects returns aren't too loud, I've been, you know, I haven't really had an issue with that. But what you're talking about is almost like a micro version of the ducking the effects that we were talking about with Nico. And in this case, what you're saying is you delay the original impulse of the reverb, for example, you know, by like 30 milliseconds or something. So and I haven't really messed too much with that myself. I like the reverbs to activate immediately because that's my personal preference, and it's kind of abstract, as are the environments I create in my mixes. They're not real. They're abstract. I'm not using the room mics and stuff like that. So I'm going for an artificial ambience anyway. And I actually prefer my reverbs are all set to zero delay reaction time. You know, immediate.
Well, I have a question. When we talk about pre-delay on reverb, for example, do we talk of the delay of the first reflection or the tail of the delay?
The delay of the first reflection. Yeah, like the delay between the event and the response from the device. I think it's more used in reverb, and it is a good way to experiment with getting more clarity out of a voice or an instrument. Sure.
I have a question about panning. as when you pan something hard left or hard right, it's a real image, and for all the other panning, you have a virtual image. So do we have something to be aware about that in the way that it's different. The real image, I mean, the sound is coming from the place we see the sound when it's panning hard left or hard right. And if you have something in the center, it's a virtual image. So is there something to be aware about that on hard panning left and right?
Yeah,
because some say that when you pan thing hard left or hard right, it's difficult to have it blended with all the other sources that are panned, because it's a mix of something coming from the left monitor and the right monitor.
Right,
so it's
right. There are extremes, and I don't really put a lot of information on the extreme ends. I naturally don't. I'm more of a monocentric producer anyway, and since a good portion of the work I do winds up on vinyl, now you're talking about a mechanical reason that you don't want to play around with the stereo too much, because like you would never put the bass on one side, of a mix if you knew it was going to vinyl, because the needle would, you risk that the needle jumps out of the groove, or unable to, like the physics, the needle dragging through, it might not stay in the groove, it might just skip out. But in order to guarantee that the needle doesn't skip out, you probably have to degrade the overall sound of the song. So there are practical purposes, physical reasons why you want the kick drum, the lead vocal, and the bass in the middle, especially the low frequency stuff. If you're cutting vinyl, you don't want to play with that. You don't want to add a stereo effect to the bass or something like that. That could only work against you. It'll work against the needle.
But there is not really an issue that on the fact that the source is coming from only one monitor, or the mix of two monitors.
Well, I think it would sound weird unless that's what you wanted.
Yeah, unless you want to use it as an effect.
Right. But I think as long as I have a complementary instrument, or complementary frequency, or musical part, like when you do reggae, I know that I got the guitarist going jump, jump, and I got the pianist going bump, bump. Immediately, those two guys get panned against each other. And I try my best to create a stereo image of the two skanks, like try as much as possible to create a sound that's like, it sounds like one thing, try and make them sound like they're just like, oh, that's a guitar, oh, it's a piano, oh, it's both, like it's tough to do. And some clients don't want that. They want to hear the definition of each one. But, musically, the parts will be left and right. I'll try and get the EQs to work with each other left and right. So I'm always thinking about the stereo image, but in a way that's not, I'm looking for something that'll work in harmony, right? I mean, some people actually, there are recordings where all the drums are in the left and, other instruments are in the right. I've never heard that on vinyl, except for like Van Gelder or something like that, the jazz recordings. That was really popular. But they weren't really pushing the limits as far as, bass and there weren't any issues with the needle jumping out of, the way they were mixed. There wasn't any problem with vinyl. I think it's interesting that the way the Beatles treated stereo is kind of like the way we treat surround.
There is a lot of mixes from the Beatles where panning extremely right. At the time, I think that they don't understand that you have this virtual image when you put the same amount of sound on the left monitor and the right monitor. It's make a center image that is virtual. So
at the time, stereo was considered a gimmick, because it wasn't a musical thing. It was a sound thing. It's like, and it's the way people looked at quad recordings in the 70s. It's like, oh, it's a cool idea for the people who have money for that kind of thing, you know, for your home theaters or something. But, you know, for the average person, you know, and back then, for the average person, stereo was like, why? You know, so like in the case of the Beatles, you look at their logbook at the studio, they'd have spent 6 hours mixing a song, and they would book another 1 hour session the following week to do a stereo version. And they would just be like, I don't know, that's fine, whatever. Stereo, woo. They didn't respect it at all. They didn't see any, you know, it wasn't like a musical thing, you know, it was a sound thing. And they're like, whatever. I mean, the engineers weren't even like, you know, whatever, it's cool. But now, you know, you have those recordings, and maybe you're in a coffee house, and, you know, one speaker is in one corner of the coffee house, and then in the other room is the other speaker, and you're treated to an a cappella performance of the Beatles, or you're treated to an instrumental performance of the Beatles. And it's cool, you know, some people
But
still
you're
do
right,
that
because
now.
in terms of energy, it's still balanced between the two events. The sources are really different.
Yeah, and they're so different that there wasn't a problem with mono compatibility either, because you weren't doing stereo things. You were just throwing mono things to one side or another. So there wasn't really like now we have, like, you know, stereo recording of, you know, of an instrument, and we have to think about that. We have to think, all right, now what is going to be the dominating stereo image here, or what is going to define the stereo image? So if I have, it's much like with effects, you know, if I have a guitar that already has a reverb on it and it sounds cool, that's cool and all, but that has then defined like the reverb situation for the whole mix, you know, because I have to work with it, you know, use it. And that's the same with like a stereo image, like a you know, Hammond B3 big stereo image. Sometimes I'll narrow it down, but otherwise I'll just say, well, it sounds cool, and that's just going to be the width of this mix, and everything else is going to have to work, you know. It's kind of defines the stereo width for me, and everything else has to go along with it, you know.
And did you have a trick for depth and width when you mixing? For example, using number, say hard left is 10, hard right is -10, things like that, to have a way of being more accurate in your depth mixing.
I mean, no numbers will work for everything, of course. So, but roughly, I would say, if we're looking at the clock, and hard left is 7 o'clock, and hard right is 5 o'clock. Let's say that's, you know, the extreme. And like what I was saying, like the drums, they would be at like 7 o'clock and 5 o'clock, and then like the rhythm instruments, more like 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 3 o'clock. And the voice would be at noon with the bass and the kick and the snare. And then the vocals might be between 11 and 1 o'clock, or between 10 and 2 o'clock. And the horns, depending on how many there are and what they're doing in the song, I might want them to be farther out, like with the rhythm instruments, like 9 and 3 o'clock, so that they're not. That's one way to preserve the space for the voice. I use panning a lot for that.
You know, when you pan out the overheads, depending on the distance of where the mics are in comparing to the drums, and also in regards to the genre of music, but sometimes then you're gonna have to put your snare drum a bit on the right or on the left, depending, because otherwise you got a snare drum in the middle with the closed mic, and then you can still hear the hi-hat and the snare from the overheads.
Mm-hmm.
You mean to keep your...
It's a tricky thing to compromise.
Yeah, I think I like having I like splitting the overheads into 2 mono tracks so that I can. So I might actually pan one less than the other, or EQ one differently than the other, or just make the volumes different. Just do whatever you want until you hear everything. Just something, and that's something I got from working with a mastering engineer in New York, where I said, I don't know why I even asked, or I was just watching him work, and I realized that I was like, oh, why isn't your compressor linked? Why isn't the EQ linked? Why are you fiddling on both sides when you could just link the compressor and then it does the same? He's like, I don't want it to do the same thing for both because I'm trying to get the stereo image better. So in order to do that, I need to work each side differently. So that's when I learned that, like, oh, we're the ones that should be making the stereo image, and all of my compressors are unlinked. Like if I use 2 compressors, like on the drum bus, I have 2 compressors, but they're not, linked to each other. And the same for the other ones. Stereo link, I mean, I'll use it on the mix bus because it's really cool because I have an SSL style mix bus compressor. So that does have a fun sound when it's linked. I do like the way it sort of homogenizes everything. And maybe that's the only point I would want to do that. But yeah, I think we have to use our ears to create a stereo image that is interesting first, and musical, and in a way that when you listen to it in mono, which we should all do when we listen to our stereo, when we like our stereo mix, we should listen to it in mono to see if there's any problem there. With this, I did talk about groups for a bit. I talked about stems. I talked about tuning and timing, image, the pizza thing, the panning thing, creating depth with panning, with stereo fields, All right, the last thing I didn't talk about yet, deliverables. We talked a bit about this the other day. What I would deliver if I were you, if you guys are working with a client, or even just for your own sakes, you're working on your own music, make sure you have a backup when you're done, and that backup would have all the mixes that you had and the stems and the individual tracks that were processed. If you can export the processed tracks from Logic or Pro Tools or whatever and save all the work you did with the EQs and the editing and just keep those tracks in another folder as waves. These things, like, we do this to guarantee we won't need them, because if we don't do this, we'll need it. And that's what backups are about. They're like umbrellas. I take my umbrella with me to make sure it's not going to rain, because Murphy's Law. It's like, if I got an umbrella, it ain't going to rain. And if I don't bring the umbrella, it's going to rain. So it's kind of like, if I don't have a backup, I'm going to need it. And if I have one, I won't. So I'd rather not need it, so I have it. So, and as far as delivering to the mastering engineer, definitely give them the stems in case they want to work that way. Give them the mix, and you write the sample rate in the mix name. This should be, whenever delivering to the mastering engineer, make sure that the sample rate is in the name, the file name. They will thank you for it. Because mastering...
So they don't see it. They don't see it directly in the files, or...
They can, but it's just a quick way to, they don't have to open up or get info. Or, yes, just as a convenience, especially if you're working with multiple sampling rates. Mastering engineers, sometimes they're working with compilations, or they're working on a record that's had multiple producers, and they really appreciate seeing the resolution and the file name. I would, specifically for mastering engineers, I would make sure the mix isn't, like I said, doesn't peak maybe above -6. That's loud enough. And I leave the questions of gain and brightness to the mastering engineer because they have better gain than I do, and they have better treble than I do. Because if I invested, let's say if I invested $32,000 into a 16-channel mix room, I've spent $2,000 on each channel, theoretically. Whereas a mastering engineer can take $32,000 and spend $16,000 on left and $16,000 on right. You're talking about a tremendous economic concentration, and they don't have like 8 compressors. They have 2, and each one's worth $5,000 or $10,000, and they don't have like 12 EQs. They don't even have a mixing desk. They just have these 2-channel processors of the highest quality. So yes, the treble from my mastering engineer sounds better than mine. The volume, the gain sounds better from them, and they want the headroom to be able to work. So that's why I think I know most mastering engineers prefer to have a quieter mix so that they can do the work. All right, for yours, Nico, I chose the master of the 3 that you sent. My notes for this. Overall, it seems kind of dark to me, and I don't think it's a question of EQ. I think it's a question of like there's like the hi-hat could be louder or the overheads. It's not a question of like that the instruments should sound brighter, but that brighter instruments should be heard more. Like the brighter instruments. So I was thinking, I wish I could hear more of the hi-hat on this one. I liked the effects treatment. I think like the timing of the long echo on the voice might be distracting, but that's kind of more of an opinion. That's not really that's more a question of aesthetic, I think. But it might be distracting to the lyrics. I don't know. Also, I'm surprised to see that this is a master, right? This is the mastered mix. So
I call it master, but just to separate it from the other mix. It's not really master.
Okay. All right. That answers my question because, if this was a mastered mix, then the mastering engineer did you wrong because, you got almost 3 more decibels of love that you should be getting from this mix, It should be hitting 0, It should be all masters should peak or sometimes I've seen minus 0.1. I've even seen minus 0.01, but that's the question of the limiter being set to a specific ceiling, and a lot of people don't want it to go to 0 because depending on the playback device, it might be clipping or not. So rather than getting even close to it, some people go minus 0.1 decibels or minus 0.5 decibels or something, depending on how loud they really want it to get. Okay, so it's not mastered. I think you had a question about the bass and getting the bass right for mastering. And I don't know if I went really far into this before, but I've posed that question to 3 different mastering engineers, and the consensus is that mastering engineers would prefer to cut bass rather than having to add bass. So ever since then, I'm very, comfortable sending the mastering engineer, mixes that are like tilted like this. I mean, there's like a lot of low frequency, and I'm not pushing a lot of high frequencies here. So it really is like from low frequency, it just drops off into the high frequencies, and there's an excess. Like when in doubt, I give more than I think, I err on the side of too much bass, too much low end, because they prefer to cut it, or I should say they don't like to add bass because it can, if they can avoid adding frequencies as much as possible, I think they prefer it, because like I said, I think I said this yesterday, but like, say you want some more sparkle in the voice, so you add 8 kilohertz on the EQ, but now you've got more hi-hat and it's getting in the way. Or, you want more bass, so you add more 60 hertz, but now you got more kick drum. So it's messy when you're trying to add stuff at that point. So I would say feel free to give, more than enough, rather than too little low end. When in doubt, turn it up. I listened to a little bit of the Sans Étrange. Let's see, where are you? I like the mix on this one.
Je vous parle dans ce couplet d'un couple qui se plaît, qui assemblait des mots d'épée sans tirer le trait, qui a couché d'histoires miroirs, du plaisir de dire et de se lire, de mots qu'aucun posé à poser, et puis c'est si bien dosé à l'oreille. Danse, 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 c'est de la transe, il vibre, 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 autant qu'il pense, oui.
Yeah, I like that. And also, to the point, I spent so much time talking about how I put the bass behind the kick and the kick first, and don't want to hear the flam and stuff. And I was thinking about it this morning. It's like, well, there are so many examples of really groovy tunes where the bass is way out in front of the kick drum. I mean, I'm remembering a Quentin Tarantino, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I don't remember what the tune is, but there's this instrumental groove that happens in the middle of it, and the bass is just like, he left the drummer in the dust, just totally long in front, and it sounds cool because it creates this like urgency, it had like this something about urgency or carelessness or something about the vibe in that tune, which totally worked, and there are lots of examples of soul music where the bass is out in front, and that could be a jazz thing. I always felt like jazz players, string bass players, were always ahead of, and once I started playing jazz, I realized it's basically it takes the note. If you're competing with the ride cymbal, you touch the ride cymbal, everyone's heard it that moment. But the bass, you got to first of all, you got to have the note in your hand, in your finger before you drop it. You can't go like this. Some people do, like Ron Carter goes like this, or Lloyd Brevet. But for the most part, the idea is, especially in the orchestral pizzicato is like, it's in your hand like a archer, right? The string, the note, you've got it, right? And at the moment the conductor says so, you let go, and that's the note. So it's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, bang. It's more like 1, 2, 3, 4, bang. You know, but in jazz, like for the note to get to the audience at the same time as a ride cymbal, you got to be ahead of things. You know, it takes a moment for that frequency to come out of the instrument, and so they would play way on top of the beat. And there are a lot of reggae players that are used to playing live on stage, like they spend most of their time playing festivals and stuff. And then they get in the studio, and it's the same thing. They were so used to getting on top of things so that the note would get out in time. But when you're in a real, you know, then you're in a studio and you're playing too soon. You know, it's a weird thing to get used to. But there are instances. So I think it's like jazz players getting into soul music might have created this sort of approach. I don't know how much it was thought out or anything like that, but I did want to say that just because this is what I do with drums and bass and kick drum and bass, there are plenty of examples why why it doesn't matter. And maybe it has more to do with my sound. You know, maybe that's something that makes my mixes sound the way they do. So I'm not going to stop doing it. And I will say, as far as finding your own sound as an engineer and as a producer, the only way we can consistently come up with a sound that we can always do, that's really our sound, the only way we can get to that point is to always be doing what we want. And even if what we want changes over the years, as long as we're trying to satisfy ourselves, and it's like, as long as we like it, that has to be the continuity in all of our work. We have to like it. We have to like what we did. And then by constantly using that as our bar, or one of our reference bars, we wind up finding out what our sound is, or not even be able to articulate, but we come to our sound, and we could be counted on for that. There's consistency, continuity. So I did want to mention that. As far as finding a sound, I think the point is to just do what you like, always, you know. And yes, when you work with clients, you have to temper that, and there will be clients that want you to do something that you don't like, and you'll do it, and you'll get paid, and then the next day you'll do something you like for yourself. You know, we have to separate the professionalism and the artist. You know, I mean, when an artist is creating, you're in a sacred place. You know, you're the Pope. You're whatever you think is important. That's who you are when you're creating. You're God, right? But the minute you're performing, like on stage, you're a servant. You're there for people. And the minute you are engineering, you are providing a service. And you have to take off the artist hat and just put your ego away. And hopefully you have something that you care about, that you're working on, so that you can have this sort of like detachment from your job as providing a service. Because you shouldn't be trying to get satisfaction from somebody else's work. You know, it's not fair to them. You should be just trying to realize what they want. But as long and it's easier to do that without feeling all butthurt and shit, as long as you do have time for yourself and do stuff that just you want. You know what I mean? So it's a key to continuity. It's the key to finding your sound. You got to please yourself, you know. So I did want to say that, and also like the whole point of mastering. I did want to say the whole point. Well, the reason it'll never be obsolete is that mastering is the stage where their superpower is objectivity, and their job is continuity, vertical and horizontal continuity. Vertical continuity in the sense that your mix sounds the same on a phone, in the car, at the club, in the headphones, that there's a continuity between devices. I guess you call it vertical, like scaling or vertical continuity. That's what that would be. Horizontal continuity is what you need when, mastering. The extreme example would be mastering a compilation. So you're a mastering engineer and you're getting a mix from, 12 different bands produced 12 different places, and you're the one that has to make them all go to the same volume and sound like they all come from the same universe, and deal with all the different sample rates and all that stuff, and do what you can do so that there's continuity from track one to track 10. So that's horizontal continuity. And between, even if I mixed all of the songs on the record, sometimes I achieve a mix that I really like and it's quieter than another mix that I really like and that's louder. And it's up to the engineer to do that, to find, what's the loudest tune here? Let's use that as the bar. Let's make everything come up to that, or however they decide to do this linear continuity is so important. And I think I already said mastering your own mixes is, we should only do that because there is no other, last resort kind of thing. Last resort. You're better off asking a friend to do it, or maybe even check. I mean, I haven't heard great things about the online mastering algorithm AI bot, but maybe one day that could be an option, because at least it's not you. If you mix the track, at least it's not you, and it's not in your.
Sometimes I use it.
How you like it?
I like it because it gives me a view of what type of mastering I can have, or I'm going to, and then since it's done in 3 minutes or 2 minutes, then I go back to my mix and I adjust, so I ping pong like that.
Wow.
And then once I'm satisfied with the bot, then I send it to the mastering engineer, because I can go fast like that. I can avoid the obvious mistakes on my mix by testing the bot.
Oh, you're talking about just hearing a quick mastering to see what happens, like to the snare drum.
Yeah.
And so cool.
Yeah, too loud, not loud enough, EQing, panning, all this stuff, effects.
Yeah, very cool. I went through that when I moved into this new room, which sounds better than the old room. It's a little darker, so my mixes are brighter. You know how that works. I mean, the last room I was in was kind of bright because the floor wasn't wood; it was ceramic, and there's more glass in that room, I guess. But in this room, I've got the Persian rug, and it's it's a wood floor, and it's like just a little bit bigger, and the ceilings are higher. But I had to get used to it. I didn't know what I was going to do. So the first thing I mixed here was something that I had produced. So I had full control. And I sent it to my mastering guy. I said, look, just give this back. I'm going to listen to it. And I'm going to make some adjustments and send it to you again. So basically did what you were doing, Nico. And I learned a lot by doing that, because the sound is brighter here, which is pleasing to everybody, I definitely had to do that at one point. I should probably try it again. I mean, at some point I also feel like, and my mastering guy, he says the same thing. It's just give me the mix. Like, I have two mixes here. I have the vocal up and I'll give you the vocal down. That's a very common thing to do. Like, once the mix has been approved by the client, I'll make, I'll say, do you want a vocal up version? These days I just send the stems, but that's always an option. And I asked my guy, do you want, I'll give you the straight one. And he said, just give me the one you like. Just, you decide. Like, he didn't want it, and I was like, yeah, just give him the one I like. Oh my God. And sometimes, the mix, I'm like, I don't want to reference anything. Cause I'm like, I like this mix. I don't want to compare it to anything. I got the mix.
But what I did, one day I did, because the bot asks you for a reference mix or reference master. So one day I took one of your mix and I gave it to the AI, and I had like a rocksteady type of band that I was mixing, and then the AI took your mix as a reference and then adjusted my mix towards your sound. It was pretty nice.
Wow.
Obviously, I'm not you, but I could I could see
the mastering engineer, you know.
No, but I could see the differences of what I needed to adjust in my mix to approach your outcome. So it was a good learning lesson.
So cool.
And it's quickly done. You know, within 15 minutes, you adjust a couple of things, and oh wow, all of a sudden I've got the Victor Rice sound.
So flattering. Oh my God. Wow. Maybe. All right. That's, you know, you got me thinking about like just, I mean, going down something somewhat masturbatory, but maybe like putting my own masters in and seeing what I can. Oh. But I'd rather, I keep just, I like to go fresh. I like to not use references. I like to, it sounds kind of hippie to say this, but I really do think the song tells you, you know, what you need to do. You know, it does. It you know, the instruments tell you, the players, the song itself. It sounds a little whatever, but I do like to let the song tell me what to do. You know, the tempo has everything to do with things, you know, it's not just key. You know, a lot of these things are decided by the song, I think. All right, for our last, I think I've pretty much hit everything I wanted to hit. I've saved Philip's tune for our sort of last thoughts, and it's kind of be a nice freshen your palate for the week. So the prepared piano, for those who don't know what that is, invented by John Cage. I got to meet the guy, really cool. And a very, very happy guy, very cool guy, very just like genuinely pleasing person to be around. And he was like, well, you know, Henry Cowell was doing stuff on the piano. And so, you know, he doesn't consider himself the inventor of this or whatever, but he really took it to another level where you're preparing the piano by adding objects and sticking them between the strings. So you might be threading some of the strings with paper. You might put a fork on the D string or on the piano, or you'd stick like some nuts and like screws or bolts in there, and they all, depending on where they are and the distance and all, you can get a different percussive sound for each note on the piano. And I don't know if that he was trying to approximate a percussion group for a performance that didn't have the space or the money for percussionists. And he wrote this thing that would have like percussive sounds. So like, you know, he sorted out which notes would buzz, which notes would be damped. You know, he'd stick a rubber mute in there. You'd stick like, just, you know, totally tweak out the piano and create this thing. And this is what it sounded. So that's what Philip did. And it's very beautiful. All right, so I've got
I
questions.
just wanted to mention there's also a Rebecca or Rebecca there, which is also prepared, like a sort of viola or fiddle, like a Brazilian fiddle, right?
Yep.
That's played in like, Brazilian folk music. And he's also prepared the Rebecca or has different preparations. But also, like, we're both moving the preparations around. So it's not like a fixed setup of the piano. It's like that's also improvised, right? The preparations are also kind of being improvised in the moment to some extent.
Oh, wow. And this was a live performance.
This is live. It's from a longer track, a longer recording, and sort of cut into smaller sections, and just recorded very basically, like, by us with. Like I have a Zoom recorder. Thomas has a Sony one, which I think is slightly better quality. And then, like, there's a couple of condensers in the piano. I think the Zoom recorder is inside the piano. And then Thomas had a close mic on the Rebecca. I did everything wrong, basically. Like, I mixed it, and I don't think we didn't master it. We gave it like it's not mastered, basically. But I did that all, like, at home in Logic, so it's not professional at all, or at that kind of standard. But I just tried to follow my ears and make things sound kind of balanced. Perhaps think about how to capture something like that in a room that's not a particularly nice room, like the storage room next to the auditorium in Funarte. That's where they keep the piano, and it's a grand piano. They let us use that piano for nothing. Like, we book it, and we can go there and use it. So it's a space that we've used a lot. We play in there a lot. So I mean, that's where we recorded it. So I guess it's trying to make the most out of the basic tools that we have. I mean, it may well be that, like, if you record a piano in a storage room with a Zoom recorder, that's what you're going to get. So, you can't make it sound, better, or, but maybe some ideas about, like, how to.
Well, my ideas are, like, first of all, I think it's brilliant to put the Zoom box in the piano. Of course, that's why we're getting so much detail on the piano. And the sound, the ambience, like, it sounds like you're in a regular room. It doesn't sound like you're in a beautiful space. It doesn't sound like it. But it really works, right? I mean, it just gives it more, in a way, it just makes it more. It sounds like a performance. It sounds like people in a room. And I think with material like this, you want that. I think you want to hear. It doesn't matter if it's a pleasing sounding room or not. I think the fact that there are two people in the room and this is happening in real time is. I would want to preserve that. I mean, I wouldn't want to hear this, I think, in a cathedral or something where with the pretty ambience. I don't think. It just sounds more real and more like, it sounds more like a musical piece instead of a soundscape. You know what I mean? It doesn't sound like it's not like it sounds like it's a piece. It's music. It doesn't sound like a sound experience exactly. There's,
although we go into that territory as well a little bit, but, like, that's the whole thing, I think, with recording this kind of music, is that it can vary so much in its dynamics, or suddenly you've got a lot of bass, or suddenly it's all very high pitched. And so sometimes it's very difficult to try to, when I'm trying to mix this, there's no one approach. It's like you have to approach each section, or because there isn't one fix that's going to work for the whole thing.
Right.
And I have a bit of difficulty with that. Like,
this is a very dynamic piece, and some beautiful transients. I love, like, where I think I can even see it here. There's this part where all of a sudden there are like two notes on the piano that have nothing done to them. It's just piano. Wow. Those, but the low notes on the piano out of nowhere. It's really nice. This could be a case where maybe there's one note that really stuck out too much, and rather than use a compressor, I would just go in there and separate that piece of the region in Logic and draw down the gain. Done. I'm working on. I just finished producing a record for a solo violinist, and it's like it's we recorded for days and days, different rooms, different mics. So we got over 100 3-minute improvisations, and so we just finally created a record, an album of 14 of them, and it's so enjoyable. At first we were kind of like, oh, what do we do? And it's like, well, you don't really, just make sure that the noise isn't, too bad from when the truck drove outside the recording studio, like real basic stuff, because it already sounded beautiful, and we didn't want it to sound, unnaturally good. We wanted it to sound natural, we wanted to maintain that person in a room thing. So, contrary to anything else I've ever produced, I used the room mic, and there was a mic in front of the violinist, a ribbon mic, and then a condenser mic farther away. And she loved that. She's like, oh, I've never heard my violin, sound right in a recording. So that was a huge, thing to get over. But in that case, in those things, we were no compression, nothing like that. It just just made any notes that got kind of unruly, we sort that out. We use the reverb a little bit, sometimes only in a very utilitarian kind of way. Like when she felt like, oh, I didn't like the way that last note died out, it sounded a little sketchy. So I just fade in, automate a reverb that extended the note so it didn't, just go dead, but it didn't sound like reverb. It just sounded like the note was extended, tiny little micro things. It was recorded in August. It took until a month ago to get mastered, and we're, thrilled with the result and everything. But yeah, it was more like, the real, I would say, try some things with recording, but I wouldn't sweat the mix. That's not what this is about, it's not what this song's about. It's not about the mix. It's about the event and the documenting of this event, it's closer to a jazz recording. But even, it's like, it would be the way Rudy Van Gelder would have treated, record the event, record it, the way we like it, and that is the mix, So I wouldn't be afraid of like the sound of the room for something like this. It only adds charm to it.
Yeah. When you say, you mentioned, there's a piano note that stuck out. Is it, so it draws your attention and you go, well, maybe I want a bit less of that. And when you're EQing, because it's very, I wouldn't be able to do like a sweep because everything's changing the whole time. You would pinpoint things just from like that's a bit too loud, or that's kind of jumping out at me.
Yeah, I guess if I could see doing a sweep on this and just finding like the sounds that are a little too much in there, that are not coming, that are just like maybe the sound of the hammer is getting louder than the sound of the note, the hammer of the piano, something like that. You're hearing too much You know, you're hearing too much of the means of production and not the product. You know, so and yeah, I would sweep around looking like, yeah, maybe get less of the hammer sounds, or if you're hearing the pedals, you know, whatever frequency that isn't a musical frequency and doesn't change, you know, it's always there. Just find that, knock it out, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's beautiful. It's refreshing. Brings me back to my days at conservatory with the new music consort and Claire Heldrich and hanging out with people like George Crumb and you know, and meeting, you know, John Cage.
Well, under what circumstances did you meet him? Was it through college?
Yeah, this is giving a wasn't really a master class, more like a Q&A. You know, I went to Manhattan School of Music, and I chose that place because they had a burgeoning jazz school, and that their contemporary. You would have loved this place. You know, the jazz and the contemporary thing. You know, I knew I wanted to be a professional bassist, and I was studying orchestral music because I thought that would make me the best bass player in general. You know, not that I wanted to be an orchestral bass player, but I just thought like, well, that kind of training, everything else will be easier. And I was right in a certain aspect, but I was wrong to think that there would be gigs for bass players in the 90s by the time I got out of school. It's like, no, we have a keyboard for that now. You know, how many bass players does it take to change a light bulb?
Nothing a piano player can't do with his left hand.
I like the other one, which is how many bass players does it take to change a light bulb? 1, 5, 1, 5, 1. But that's a music theory joke.
And how many guitar player you need to change the bulb? 10. One changing the lamp, and the 9 other telling, "Oh, I won't do like that."
Steve Vai wouldn't have done it like that.
There's a quote by John Cage that I like a lot. It's not a quote; it's like a story that he was at this concert, like in a concert hall, and then the intermission came, and he ran into some friends, and they said, "Oh, you know, John, you should come and sit with us at the back. The sound is much better." And they said, he just laughed at them and went, "Imagine one sound being better than the other," or something like that.
Wow.
Something along those lines. Imagine a sound being better than another. I thought that was kind of interesting. You know?
Yeah.
Like he just totally lived that thing of, his thoughts. It's always there. No, it's like even someone saying like, come and sit over here because it sounds better. It's like,
yeah, he really was very unassuming and just looked like he just, you know, imagine somebody just came down off a mountain in Tibet and just had everything sorted out and just like the happiest person and totally at peace with everything and amused by everything. It's really, really cool.
I heard these, he made a sort of radio program with Morton Feldman. Maybe it was in the 60s. And there's like hours of it, like 3 hours or 4 hours of it, and it's on YouTube. And it's them just talking about like stuff, very like free-flowing conversation. And they're like sitting there and smoking and chatting. And it's several hours. It's on YouTube, the whole thing. And he even talks about coming to Sao Paulo, John Cage, about being invited to Sao Paulo and stuff.
Wow.
It's worth. It's under some ASMR kind of thing. What's that called? ASMR? Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's like I don't know. They gave it some title like that, but it's John Cage and Morton Feldman just talking, you know, shooting the shit, as it were.
Awesome.
It's great. It's great.
It's funny because I studied a little bit with this guy named Niels Vigeland, who had studied extensively with Morton Feldman, and his stories are so funny. And I never met him, but the guy. But it's so funny. You're talking about music. Morton Feldman's music is so soft and delicate and spacious and silence oriented. And then to meet, you know, the way he talked about this guy that was just like this big, burly, loud spoken, chain smoking Brooklyn dude. Yeah, the fucking, it's like, no, same guy, you know, pretty wild. That's a lost generation of people who, you know, inspired, you know, we're not only great, you know, contributors, but just inspired people phenomenally, you know. Like, you know, you think of like Brian Eno's attitude or Rick Rubin's attitude. I mean, John Cage was that, you know, 50 years earlier. He brought that. He made them possible. Listen, I'll be sending material sometime. You know, I don't know when, because it takes me time to edit the movies and stuff, the video, and the materials like the JPEGs and the PDFs and the things. And please stay in touch. And whenever you have a question about something, just shoot me an email. You know, this doesn't end here. Like, conversation doesn't end here. And I love talking about this kind of shit, if you haven't noticed. So really, please, you know, I love getting emails that aren't spam and that aren't, you know, bills. You know what I mean? So,
and by real people.
Yeah, real people with like real issues I care about. So please feel free to hit me up with anything, question that you forgot about, whatever. All right, guys.
Cool. Thanks.
Have a great week. Thanks so much. Let's hope
Thank
to
you
hear
very
from
much.
you guys. Ciao.